Good afternoon. Sorry to be starting a few minutes late. I'm Dave Cortese, County Supervisor, joined by Supervisor Chavez, who co-chairs, was a co-chair for Finance Government Operations Committee, and she chairs Children, Seniors, and Families Committee, a committee on which I also serve. So we are agendized for Brown Act purposes for both those meetings today. But I do want to indicate that either way we have a quorum, and we're here, and we'll just ask the rest of the folks up here on the dais to introduce themselves, and then we'll move on to public comment.
Yeah, Greg Ituria, County Budget Director.
Steve Mitra, Assistant County Counsel.
Hi, good afternoon. Miguel Marquez, Chief Operating Officer.
Jeff Smith, County Executive.
Great, thank you. And of course, the rest of the folks that are here will be presenting, will introduce themselves real time. Having called the meeting to order, we'll move on to public comment, which is item number 2. Mr. Largent is here with a request to speak under public comment. You can come on up, Scott. And for those others who might be considering speaking on public comment today, this is an opportunity to speak on items that are not on the agenda today but are pertinent to county business. And you're welcome to come forward. We always appreciate it if you fill out one of these yellow slips and get it to the clerk ahead of time, just for purposes of keeping a record here. That said, at this moment we have one speaker. Scott, you can go ahead and commence. You'll have up to 3 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dave. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. At yesterday's reentry meeting, I kind of forgot to, I say a lot of things over and over again, but why is drug court at our new family court facility? Why would they even think to put that over there? Now, I know there are certain judges that handle, drug court, dependency court, but is it just so they could have the shiny new courthouse? Because that should be over here at the Hall of Justice. It's an obvious thing. And when people get out of drug court, let's say things aren't going too well, or they've missed appointments, or whatever's happening, they can walk right across the street and get high. And it's a war zone over there. And we all know that. I'm just wondering why that light's not going off, or people are like, hey, let's move it back over here where it belongs. Because I don't think people are going to be smoking methamphetamines and defecating out in front of our criminal court right there, because we're right in front of the jail. The fastest point they can get in there is quick from doing that. So I hope people can pay attention to that. My daughter, when she has to come for my visits now, my ex has to park over there at St. James Park. She's not as familiar with the downtown area, so she's got to feed the meter right there. She gets my child out. So my child is now getting an education on what a crackhead is, what somebody that's naked in the park, people that are fighting. And it's just sad that my daughter has to see that. And that's the only option I have to be able to see my child. When I was a kid, my mom was a fashion model. So we would, I'd play hooky from school. Mom would call me in sick, and she'd drive me up to San Francisco. And she would get clothes custom made and stuff like that. So I'd be up there with her. And we got to experience what it was like to see that. Now, it was not as shocking as what I'm seeing right at downtown now. And I would hope sooner or later also that we maybe should start staffing each one of these light rail junctions with a sheriff's deputy that will constantly be there. So I understand they float around, BTA does it, everything like that. People need to start feeling safe, and people don't. People don't want to ride the light rail. They don't want to go to businesses down there. People are just jumping ship. And I think we could do a better job and maybe protect people that are in recovery out there. I don't want to sit at the light rail and see people doing that stuff. I'm coming up on 4 years of being clean, and I should not be smelling meth as I walk out of a courthouse or out of an appointment. Everything you guys have tried to direct me through is downtown on the light rail or Santa Clara Street. Everything mental health, behavioral health, counseling classes, even just anything is down there. Please start paying attention to this. I talk about it a lot, and we should start listening to people like myself that come in here. I mean, we really should. We could fix this. We really could. And Laura's Law is the nuclear option for nobody paying attention for 3 years. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Evidently concludes request to speak under public comment. I'm not seeing anyone else come forward. And we have no other written requests. We'll move to item 3, which is approval of the consent calendar and changes to the committee's agenda. Supervisor Chavez, let's go to your recommendations first, and then I'll have one on the cadre item and see if that works.
Great. So what I wanted to recommend is that the countywide hiring, that we continue that to January. And my reason for that is that we have a lot of other items on the agenda, and we either need to schedule something specifically just for this so we can get through it, or put it at the end. And I didn't want to put it at the end because I don't want staff to wait for an hour and a half and then not be heard. So I'd like to continue that to our next meeting or a special meeting and leave that up to the chair to determine. And then on the other items, I would like to just leave, I'm comfortable with the current consent calendar unless there's something you would like to add to consent.
Thank you. Item 6 is the cadre item, which came off of a board referral that I brought forward asking county executive and his team to determine what would be appropriate, if anything, in terms of funding for cadre relative to keeping it going, to making sure it's sustainable going forward. And they did a nice job of laying that out for us in item number 6. So I have no questions or no reason to inquire. It really leaves us with a kind of an up or down decision as to whether the board wants to approve that funding. It's about $21,000 and change. So I was going to suggest that we just put it on consent with a comment to go ahead and move it to the board with the appropriation request, and then we'll see what the board wants to do with it there.
Great.
Okay. So the regular agenda will no longer have item 4. It's continued to the regular January meeting of this committee, unless the chair, yours truly, decides to set up a special meeting for that item. And item 6 is put on consent with the comments I attached to it. The rest of the consent calendar, for those paying attention, are items 12 through 17, and they are accurately depicted on the published agenda. So we will come back to the top of what's left on the agenda now and show that as a unanimous motion on the consent calendar, please. We will move to item.
May I just add one other thing?
Sure.
One of the items that was on there is item 14, and this is the semi-annual child abuse and neglect center report. And I just wanted to appreciate the direction that this has continued to go. The reason I'm not pulling it off today for discussion is that I know this is part of a bigger set of discussions we're having about the foster youth programming, and would just like to ask staff that when we have the conversation in January, that we just include this background staff report as part of that transmittal to the board. And, I mean, just as an attachment.
I think we understand, and we'll just attach those comments to the approved motion on the consent calendar.
Thank you.
Okay, we will again come back to what is now the top of the agenda, item 5. And item 5 is receive management audit of the Office of the Sheriff non-custody operations and provide direction relating to audit recommendations. This was held over from our October 17th meeting, and we'll go ahead and commence with that item now. Invite the teams up here. We have the auditor here, representation from the Sheriff's Office, including the Sheriff. Thank you for being here. Supervisor Chavez, how would you like to proceed on this item in terms, just in fairness to the auditor, in terms of how we would like to see the presentation, which ordinarily would start with her, it's her audit, but how we would like to proceed with it and how finite. I know she would generally like to know how deeply we want her to delve into any particular items in her overview. So,
Great.
thank you.
So I think it would be great if we could have an overview from both the auditor and also the department. And then there was just one overall item that was agreed upon that I wanted to give feedback to. And then I thought what we could do is go through the areas where there was partial agreement or disagreement, just to use our time as best we can.
Okay, that sounds great. And let me just as a matter of courtesy, we have one speaker on the item, Roger Winslow from the Deputy Sheriff's Association, and I'm sure you're probably going to be here for the duration. See it nodding his head. But if you'd like to speak now at the outset to frame your comments or frame them for the presenters, you're welcome to do that. Sometimes, as you know, we like to create that opportunity so the public comment is on the floor early, and it gives people an opportunity to try to respond, and also helps me to make sure I don't forget to call you up here later. So thank you. And you'll have up to 2 minutes, because we're not on public comment. We're on item by item comment, when traditionally we'll go with a 2-minute opportunity at this point, and any written items that you have to submit. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Supervisor. My name is Roger Winslow, Vice President of the DSA here in Santa Clara County. As this committee and the public digest this audit, I want to put it into context. This audit took 2 years to complete because the Sheriff's Office refused to cooperate, refused to turn over documents, and refused to participate in exit interviews. It then took another 2 months to receive a late response to the auditor's report. Inaccuracies in the report claimed by Lori Smith are self-inflicted due to the failure to contribute. But this isn't new. The audit over the implementation of the jail reforms was terminated without completion for many of the reasons faced in this audit. The details in this audit demonstrate what we saw in the Blue Ribbon Commission on improving jail operations. When Lori Smith is faced with bad news and criticism, she attacks. Just like she attacked Judge Cordell when she would not concede to Lori Smith's demands for hiding the truth. The intimidation and threats experienced by the auditors is but a glimpse of the dysfunction within the Sheriff's Office. Cheryl and the audit team, in the words of the spoken by retired Sergeant Ted Atlas, welcome to the I've Been Bullied by Lori Smith Club. Overall, the audit exposes how far behind the Sheriff's Office is in not modernizing its deliveries of services, its business processes, and its staffing. A significant number of sheriff's responses to the audit reported disingenuous and some are flat-out fabrications. Case in point, the Sheriff's Office has failed at least 2 times in the past 15 years to implement a new RMS system. We are now working on a third, a process 4 years in the making. Lots of promises, but no action. Take, for instance, the Palo Alto Courthouse. There is nothing today done differently than was at the time of the escape. The temporary staffing increase was eliminated a few months after everyone stopped looking and because of lack of personnel. Image over substance is another common problem with the Sheriff's Office, and once again demonstrated in the Sheriff's responses. In item number 2.2, the Sheriff states that several office-wide surveys to engage employees have been conducted. False. I'd like to know what those surveys are. Based on the history of the obstruction and the new incoming oversight team, it's likely to face many of the same challenges that this audit team did today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for being here, and we'll go ahead and proceed, Madam Auditor, with your presentation as outlined by Supervisor Chavez.
Good afternoon. I'm Cheryl Solov. I'm with the Management Audit Division, and I have with me to the far right Christina Malamet, Dan Goncher, and Nick Menard, who worked on this audit. And I'm going to ask Dan to provide the overview. Dan was the project manager.
Good afternoon, supervisors. My name is Dan Goncher with the Management Audit Division. We completed the management audit of the Sheriff's Office operations. This excludes adult custody operations. It was part of the Management Audit Division's fiscal year 2017-18 work plan by the Board of Supervisors. The audit was conducted in conformity with generally accepted government auditing standards as set forth in the 2011 revision of the Yellow Book of the U.S. Government Accountability Office. The purpose of our audit was to examine the operations and management practices of the Sheriff's Office and to identify opportunities to increase efficiency, effectiveness, and economy. This report on the management audit of the Office of the Sheriff's Operations, excluding adult custody operations, details 10 findings and 59 recommendations. The findings cover performance management overall, Sheriff's Office staffing and retention. The third is specifically on patrol staffing. Our fourth finding was on investigations, services, and staffing. The fifth was on improving court security. Sixth was on internal oversight. The seventh was the oversight of the Sheriff's Office over third parties. The eighth was covering the training programs at the Sheriff's Office. The ninth, information technology project management. And the 10th, security and safety of facilities and assets.
Can you go over 9th and 10th again?
Sure. So the ninth finding covered information technology project management. And the 10th covered security and safety of facilities and assets.
And how does that differ from internal security? I mean, how would you say it differs? You were earlier saying third-party security, and right before third-party security, you talked about. I'm saying.
Sure. Okay, so Section 7 covers third-party oversight, so the Sheriff's Office has responsibility to oversee public safety operations at Stanford University and at the Valley Medical Center.
Oh, you're saying, I see. So in other words, county jurisdiction per se versus cities or Stanford or some other VTA.
Correct.
Or some other.
And,
Got it. I understand.
Okay. Yeah. And Section 10 is looking at how the Sheriff's Office manages its capital assets internally. Yeah.
Got it.
In addition to these findings, we also had we conducted a survey of similarly sized peer jurisdictions in California, and that is included in Attachment A. And we are available for any questions, or we can go into more detail if you desire.
I think Supervisor Chavez wanted you to help lead us in.
I'll pull off the ones that.
Oh, okay,
yeah,
fine.
So I'm good.
Thank you. Any questions then on the general overview before you start pulling off items, Supervisor Chavez?
No.
Okay. Any overview response? I mean, basically, we just heard the scope of the audit, Sheriff, I think, more than anything. But before we go into a little bit more of a item-by-item review.
Yes, just very briefly, I'd like to introduce Assistant Sheriff Mike Doty, Director Juan Gallardo, and Assistant Sheriff Ken Binder. And I want to first mention that we at the Sheriff's Office really have exceptional staff and provide excellent service to those communities that we serve, and we're real proud of what the men and women of the Sheriff's Office do every day. What we've done is we've responded to each of the recommendations, and you'll see that on many of them that we are in agreement. Several of the recommendations talk about the need for additional personnel to perform some of those functions, and we appreciate Harvey Rose providing that recommendation. Lieutenant Adam Oberdorfer, who has worked with us on the audit, will be here in a few minutes. He's with procurement right now, actually on the RMS system, and we'll also be able to answer any questions, but we remain available to respond to any questions you may have.
Okay, and thank you for doing those introductions as well. Should have given you that opportunity at the outset. Supervisor Chavez?
Thank you. And then Sheriff, if we get to any of these that you want to wait for him, just let us just say when we'll come back to it. So let me start by saying thank you to all of you, and I really very much appreciated the thoughtfulness both of the audit itself and of the response. I actually had there were some conclusions that I've come to that I want to see if at the end I'm still thinking what I'm thinking right at this moment. But I wanted to start with a broad question, and I'm not sure, Dr. Smith, if this is something that that your team can respond to, or Sheriff, if you know the answer to this, and that is that there are a number of areas in here that really touch on staffing, and I just didn't recall when the staffing study, like where we are in that staffing study process and when that would be coming to the board.
I don't think I know the exact date, but it should be within the next month or two. Winter. What?
So when it's still dark outside early is what you're saying? So sometime in the next month or two?
Yeah.
Okay.
And as a comment, also in the, I'm sorry, I can't talk. In the staffing study will be of the jail system, and there will be a further study on the non-custody, which this audit covers. That has not started yet, but the
Oh, so
custody.
the second staff, okay.
Yes.
So that's really important to know, but we are expecting to do the staffing study for the non,
Yes.
okay, for the non-jail staff, okay.
And then there's a separate study that the board asked for, as you well know,
On
about
custody health.
custody
Yeah.
health. But
That'll
there'll
be
be
internal.
three separate.
Got it. And the reason I asked that question in particular, Juan, you got lucky there. The reason I asked that question in particular was that I'm interested in understanding how the recommendations that you all are making could and should be folded into the staffing study. So if you could just give that some thought as we're going through the process would be helpful. So I'm going to start right at the beginning on one of the agrees, and this is 1.1 on one of 19, and I'm going to use the document that you gave us that squares up everybody's feedback. And on this one, this is developing and implementing a strategic plan and being able to update it annually. And I think particularly this was low-hanging fruit, I think from your perspective, but from my perspective, this feels like a very important body of work. The question I had is that it also feels like this is an expensive body of work. And so I don't know, Sheriff, now if there's a line item in your budget for the opportunity to do these kinds of strategic plans, whether it's for the whole organization or a subset or a department, which I imagine may shift based on the year and based on the new emerging issues that we're addressing. I particularly think this is important as we're going through the getting ready for OCLEM and then other activities that we've been looking at as it relates to the reforms overall in the jail that may have some impact on this part of your organization.
Yes, we have not asked for it, but it would be something that I would welcome maybe in an upcoming budget. We reached out to several county departments to see strategic plans, and I think it's something that maybe other departments within the county ought to take on also, because I do think it's that important. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure I've seen any really good models of organizations. I know that some have them, but many do not.
Mm-hmm. And I actually think when we do the countywide strategy setting session, that's actually something that we may even be able to be more precise in terms of the organizations we'd like to go first. I think the opportunity with your office has to do with just the volume of changes that we're going through. So I appreciate your point that we don't have a model and that you may end up being that model. And the second part is that the size and complexity of your organization may require a significant investment. Yes, thank you. So, okay, on that front, then what I'm going to want to do is make sure that we include this as part of our strategic planning discussion. Yes, Dr. Smith.
Can I just make a comment
Sure.
following up on what you're talking about? Also, as the board well knows, we're in the midst of consent decree compliance, which is also related to staffing. And so just for completeness sake, there are some issues related to the report that you'll be getting reports on in closed session related to the litigation pending. They'll interdigitate responsibilities.
Mm-hmm. Well, and actually that's partly I think that's exactly why the issue of a strategic plan is so critical. And I do think that given the sheriff's responsibilities for both custody and on-the-street services, that balance is challenging too. So I think that's right. Thank you. On that front, what I would like to make sure of is that as the next steps on this, that we're including it in the overall priority setting session. And Dr. Smith, that as we discuss those priorities, that you give us your feedback on where you think we could be looking in addition to the Sheriff's Department. And then I also would like to make sure that as part of the budget process, we at least discuss the opportunities to invest in getting this done with the Sheriff's Department sooner rather than later. Thank you. And then if we could go on to page 3 of 19, and this is item 2.3, and this is directing the personnel captain to clearly distinguish current vacancy levels from predicted future vacancy levels in both internal reporting and external reporting to the Board of Supervisors. And it's a partial agreement, and I wanted to better understand what the challenge is with the predictions of vacancies. And I see that there's a concern about irresponsibility. I just don't think I understood exactly what the implication of that was, or what the source of risk to the public forum was.
Sure, Supervisor. So the prediction of vacancies is a challenge because we have two components that we need to evaluate. Number one is the age of the employee, and the secondary is time of service, both of which are relevant factors for an individual's personal determination on when they will retire, when they're eligible and when they choose to retire. So we do run internal reports highlighting the number of employees that are eligible for retirement based on age and years of service, but being able to predict exactly how many will actually retire is the challenge, because we have seen trends where some employees will retire at the retirement age despite reaching maximum years of service. Others will go well beyond the retirement minimum age, beyond the years of service. So that's where we have a struggle. We do try to make our best guess estimate when we predict future vacancies. The other determination comes down to success rates in our academy training program and our in-service training for field training out in patrol. Those percentages, we do rely on the failure rate of the academy and the field training program to predict future vacancies. But as what we're seeing lately, an increased number of tenured deputies that are seeking employment opportunities in other parts of the state that are more economically friendly to cost of living. And this has been highlighted through our exit interviews that our personnel captain maintains when we have separations. So there's so many variables that come into trying to forecast those vacancies. We do the best we can with the information that we have.
So let me make a recommendation on this front and tell me if what concerns might be still in existence with this. My belief is that there are certain departments in the county that that we need to overstrength in hiring. And one of, for example, I think in county comm, like I think the idea that we ever think we're going to be fully staffed there is not likely. And as a matter of fact, on the CAN Center, which was earlier on our agenda, we overstrength in two different positions there, because the turnover rate is not entirely predictive, but we've seen enough over enough years that we're recognizing that in order to maintain the percentage we want in calls answered, we've got to be able to hire. One of the challenges I think that you all have and that we have is better understanding what the level of investment needs to be made, whether it's in recruiting or training, or frankly even what strategies we need to be using to retain people. And so what I'm interested in getting from you is a dashboard that allows us to look at ranges of vacancies, because my expectation isn't that you're going to actually know the exact number, but that we do know enough about the employees and that we can follow those trends over a number of years. And frankly, we use predictive modeling as an example when we do when we look at, how many people we think are going to retire, so we know how much money to put aside for pensions and benefits and all of that. So we feed that information in now for our financial stability, but being clear on where people are in their process, it would mean that you would say we have X number of people who are at the age that they could retire and will be over the next 3 years, and X, to me, I'm not trying to catch you guys doing something. You said it was going to be this and it was that. I think we're trying to understand how to plan.
Yeah, I completely agree, and we do implement those criteria, but what we're also seeing is generational trends, not only on the recruitment side, trying to recruit qualified, talented individuals to come into this profession, but also the generational trends on stability, staying with a particular organization and not leaving due to a variety of reasons. So all of these factors are factors that we continue to look at. We're putting a little more emphasis on out-of-state recruitment, which seems to be fruitful for some of our allied partner agencies, because we work in collaboration. We're all trying to pull from the same pool. So we're exploring those options as well. But that's also a catch-22, because what we're finding and hearing is that a lot of law enforcement professionals throughout the country will take an opportunity to come to California and receive California post-training, and then turn around with that certification and leave and go back to their home state.
Or Idaho is where I...
Right.
Yeah, no,
So-
I get it. But I guess what I'm asking just kind of, and that totally makes sense to me. There are some risks there, but concretely, we're learning enough that we could create a dashboard and that we can create ranges so we can do planning. Is that accurate?
Yes, I think
Okay.
that creating a dashboard and creating a planning program is absolutely possible.
And again, I don't think we're trying to, and the other thing is I think the trends will allow us to be more strategic about, even the structure of our contracts. Because I think the other thing is we're not necessarily, I think newer, younger people are not so excited about benefits. One, because they never think they'll get old, but two, because to your point, I think the point you raise is a really good one, which is how long do people stay? Does that address the issue that you were concerned about?
Yes, Supervisor Chavez, that does address our concern.
Great. All right. Then I'm going to go on to item 2.5. And this is also,
Supervisor Chavez, before
Yeah.
we jump ahead to that, can we stop at 2.4
sure.
for a second, which seemed like it was left to the committee unless I'm
Oh, you're right.
missing
I didn't mean
something.
to skip that.
I
Yeah,
just,
go ahead.
it's one that I had a question about that relates back to the discussion we were just having, which is, how does this relate back to the hiring and vacancy issue? There was some part of the discussion I just heard that made me want to believe that with the career type decisions for sworn law enforcement that complicate, perhaps in a good way, who shows up and getting through the academy and everything else, that it might be more flexible and predictable to have civilian coded positions at a more broad-based level, just to create flexibility and predictability in hiring. So I'm not trying to go back and rehash the conversation we just had. I'm looking for the short answer on whether I'm misreading it completely or whether those two things are connected at all.
Thank you, Supervisor. On both 2.4 and 2.6, I think the sheriff has a similar perspective, which is that bringing in civilian employees doesn't necessarily change the challenge with hiring sworn, and they still have to go through a similar background, and there's still similar challenges. I think we have a similar vacancy rate within our civilian positions as we do within our sworn in terms of just percentages. Our big challenge here is that, for example, in 2.6, there's a recommendation to potentially remove up to 81 sworn. That's a huge number for a county of our size and for an agency that has the staffing levels that we do to provide public safety. Additionally, having sworn personnel provides a lot more latitude in assignment. And, you know, we do have, looking at the comparisons to other counties that the auditors looked at, most of the positions that they used as comparisons, we already have those as civilians. You know, certainly there's ways to look at it. I think primarily that's on our custody side. And on the enforcement side, one of the things that we did notice in the analysis is that our agency likely does lag behind other agencies of similar size in total civilians, but it also lags slightly behind on total sworn, in terms of if you just look at pure percentages.
Okay, that's enough for me on those items. I was, even though I know the items 2.4 and 2.6 were just connected, I was a little more inclined to agree with the sheriff coming in on 2.6 is to essentially leave the 81 existing sworn positions fundamentally the way they were. I was just reading into 2.4 that there might be some value in starting to try to phase in more civilian quote-unquote positions. But Supervisor Chavez, I don't know what your thoughts are on that. If we want to try to come to closure on this, I know you wanted to get to 2.5.
No, actually, I didn't mean to skip 2.4, but what I would like to do is just give the auditor a chance to weigh in on this, and then just to get their thoughts on your reflections.
So regarding the 81 positions, that was an estimate to bring Santa Clara County in line with peers. We found they had the lowest rate of civilian staff compared to peer counties, which just indicated to us that there needs to be a review. So we're not saying civilianize 81 positions. That was just an estimate to say, okay, if we brought them up to the average, that's about what it would look like. So our recommendation is that ESA do a civilianization analysis of the positions, and then over time through attrition, if they've identified positions that should be civilianized, they can move with retirements sworn staff that are in those positions into positions that should only be completed by sworn staff, and then replace those with civilian positions over time. So we're not saying cut 81 sworn staff positions.
So if I could just add, on 2.6, which is, the recommendation is actually directed to ESA to just conduct a study. And ESA, in their response to the audit, agreed with that and noted that there had been a shift of sworn positions into civilian positions into sworn positions over time. So although the Sheriff's Office disagrees with that recommendation, it actually was to ESA, which agreed with it.
Yeah, I'm not hearing much compelling on either side, to be honest, as to why it makes a difference. And I have to admit, I did not look or asked to look at the peer review closely enough to determine whether jurisdictions that are dealing heavily in custody like we do, for example, might have a different ratio that was brought up at least as an assertion by the Sheriff's Department. But, it's hard to think of just taking the step of doing a study as anything but benign, other than the fact that I know ESA is nice to agree to that, given all the work they have to do right now. So I think it gets up to us at some point if we want to order up another study. So.
Right. So, Sheriff?
I think that that's something that can also be addressed by the staffing study that is being done by a contractor that's already been selected. So I think that they'll also include that on the staffing study, I hope.
And what I was actually going to, I think that's right. And what I would recommend to, Martha, are you managing that study? Okay. What I was actually going to suggest is that point be raised from, but really from a specific perspective, which is looking at the services we're providing and the best mechanism for providing those services. Because in some respects, and I'll just use San Jose as an example, they have expanded their I don't know what you call it. They're not police personnel, but service officers. I think.
Community officers.
Yeah, the community service officers. And in some instances, I think they've been really helpful in terms of being able to go out and, like, for example, we had a bunch of mattresses thrown on our street. Normally that would have been code enforcement, but the community safety officer could come. They took a picture. They left the mattresses, which I was a little concerned about, but it's a very interim, an interim way to address a problem that kind of crosses over two boundaries, but it's not violent. It's really the interacting with the community on some of those levels. So nonetheless, what I would like to do is make sure that we add both 2.4 and 2.6 into that study with a very specific question, which is asking about the what other jurisdictions are doing, but even more importantly to me is better understanding what kind of problem we're trying to solve with each of the kind of staff people.
I think that's really important. And I would just ask in that particular case that not necessarily calling for a meet and confer because they know how to assert that themselves, but that as far as the study that's ongoing, if it isn't happening already, at least on this particular issue, that the DSA have an opportunity to comment on qualitative issues, you know, in terms of response. And the reason, because I was actually prompted when you use a good example of San Jose using community service officers, and then, of course, my mind and my bias looks at the flip side of that coin, which is after they chased off 500 police officers, they didn't have much choice but to hire civilians to go out and do that work. So, yeah. But you really hit upon that at the end when you said, let's look at, you know, what the causation is in these other jurisdictions. Why are they doing that before we make a decision? So I appreciated that.
Thank you.
So I appreciate that direction. I support it.
Great. So that will take us to.
County Executive has a comment.
Oh, sure.
I just want to be clear, since we're trying to make sure that we get the scope of the staffing study correct. I sort of understood the recommendation from the auditor related to non-sworn staff positions having to do with duties like administrative duties that weren't where it wasn't necessary to be badged in order to do that. Supervisor brought up a different population of areas where you could have a non-sworn officer do something that was classically done by a deputy. Do you want us to include both of those issues?
Yes, only for this reason. And I think this has been a challenge for our department, I mean our sheriff's department, and also I think Dave's right with the city of San Jose, but one of the things I've been reflecting on is when the district attorney has had to come to us for more investigators, the reason we're getting more investigators is because we have a city that can't, like the city of San Jose, that can't hire up.
Yep.
And in some instances, and I think Assistant Chief Doty, did I say your title right? Assistant Sheriff, I'm sorry. When Assistant Sheriff, when you were talking about us training people and then having them leave, and then what are the duties that we can share that may not put us in quite the same at the same risk of not having coverage? And so you're right that some of that may be more administrative. I think the thing that they would tell us, and I think this is part of the reason we have a hard time hiring civilians too, is they still have to go through a background check, and they need to still be trained. And once that background check is solidified for them and they've been trained, they also have options other places because these are highly specialized areas. So I do think, Dr. Smith, we want to look at both because we may need to look at some of it as an interim step to getting a bigger changes that the department may need.
Right. And I was also thinking it's possible that looking at the peer organizations, they have more civilian staff because they have just more staff, which changes the ratio.
Yeah.
But, you know, we'll ask the.
Well, and I would just say too, or we have other situations, like we wouldn't want to compare ourselves to San Jose in that in that perspective. And there's actually one other item in here I was sort of intrigued with that we'll get to about who responds to what kind of
Yeah,
issue
right.
for exactly that same reason. Like, you know, I would say the number one complaint I get from people in San Jose is that there is no one to take a report, even sometimes when it's a serious crime. So
We'll make sure we include all three.
that would be great. Thank you. Item 2. To me, item 2.4 and 2.6 are very, very closely linked. I don't know if they're, and I understood exactly the point you raised, that you're not asking us to remove sworn officers for civilian, but really that we're taking a deeper dive and looking at this, and then if anything were to happen, it would happen through attrition. Do you feel like we fully addressed 2.4 and 2.6? Because I would put both of them in the staffing study that we just discussed.
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Thanks. I saw someone lean in and heard your voice, so sorry for the, what? Where'd that come from? So on 2.5, this is the, I think this is really similar to the discussion we had earlier too. And Assistant Sheriff Doty, and the reason is really what I was trying to get with 2.3 and 2.5 was the mechanism for doing that, I think is actually expressed in 2.5, which is these public studies. Do you feel like we have covered that enough? I think we've resolved both of them if what the staff is going to be doing is giving us dashboards and giving us ranges instead of specifics. And then the only other thing I wanted to add is I think there needs to be, as part of the report out to the committee, there also needs to be at least an annual report out of what trends you're seeing. I think that's pretty important. Any thoughts or concerns about that?
No concerns. I think that addresses that, Supervisor, and the annual report showing those trends, I think would also be valuable to share.
Thank you. And does that address both? Okay.
Yes.
Great. So then we're going to move on to page 6. And this was the patrol staffing plan, and I will say honestly, this is one I would really like assistance with, because the disagreement here seemed significant and important to me, and not one that I think I entirely understood. So do you mind just taking a minute to talk about item 3.1, maybe from the auditor's perspective, and then if I could get the sheriff's perspective on this?
Yes, so we have recommended that the sheriff's office submit a patrol staffing plan and really evaluate patrol staffing levels based on workload. This is a best practice for law enforcement agencies, and it's recommended by the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies and the International City County Management Association also support this approach. And really what this means is that the sheriff's office would set a goal, something like, okay, we want about 30% of deputies' time to be spent responding to calls for service, because it's also really important to us that they are doing crime deterrent activities like patrolling high crime areas. And so we want to make sure that our staffing levels are adequate so that we can meet those goals. So it means setting that goal and then also looking at your calls for service and saying, okay, we know that deputies spent this amount of time responding to calls for service in this area. So that means that we need this level of staffing to really meet that goal. So that's what a workload-based staffing approach is. In contrast, the current approach is a minimum staffing level. And so that's where the agency sets staffing levels sort of based on perceived needs of what makes the most sense for public safety and officer safety. But it doesn't kind of concretely tie staffing levels based on actual workload. And the risk of using a minimum staffing approach is that if your minimum staffing levels are too high, relative to kind of what's really warranted based on calls for service. That means that you're going to have higher overtime levels because when you fall below that minimum staffing, they're going to hire overtime to get to that minimum staffing level. And then on the flip side, if your minimum staffing levels are too low, relative to what workload would need, calls for service would need, that means that, you know, you're probably not doing enough of those crime deterrent efforts like active patrolling. So this just requires some analysis on the part of the department to kind of set these priorities and then sort of look at the data once a year, every 3 years to sort of see where they are. And they say, okay, we think in this patrol area, officers are spending 50% of their time responding to calls for service, and that might mean that maybe we need more staffing in that area because they're probably not doing enough crime deterrent activities. So that's what this recommendation means.
Thank you.
I think fundamentally we don't necessarily disagree with a work-based model. There's a lot of complexities in the size of our county, particularly being a sheriff's office. We have to plan for responses in very rural areas, and at the same time also plan for responses in areas like Cupertino or Burbank. And that's what the minimum staffing approach has kind of allowed us to do, is to understand what minimal amount of units we would need for a call for service, whether it be out in San Antonio Valley or in other areas of our county. Additionally, as the auditor mentioned in their report, it's not easy to do work-based, particularly because it requires a lot of analysis. And there's no necessary set standards or percentages for staffing. Most importantly, the sheriff's office takes our response to the community very seriously, and we look at how quickly we can get there when we're needed, and that's another major factor in how we determine our staffing levels. We actually do analysis of our calls for service in addition to many other factors that come into play, because our CAD calls for service are just one small percentage of what we do on a daily basis. So for example, most recently, based on call for service volumes and other data, we determined that the swing shift in our West Valley district, being Cupertino, Saratoga, that the number of calls for service kind of dictated a switch in their hours, so that the swing shift worked slightly earlier and there were more deputies on the streets during a higher volume of calls in those swing hours, or those evening hours. So we're not necessarily opposed to the science behind it. There's a lot of research and interesting concepts there, but we do have a lot of complexities with the size of our county and how we evaluate that data and determine, for example, travel time throughout the county of Santa Clara.
So here's a thought that I have reading, and I'll say 3.1, 3.2, and 3.3, and even the next one, 3.4 to me are all kind of bundled together in the same sort of, the same frame of discussion. And it appears to me that the opportunity to dive deeper into 3.1 and 3.2, and I'll get to 3.3 in a minute, are actually of value to the department. And I think that what I'm sure I don't understand yet is what the downside is to your point, getting deeper, taking a deeper dive into these different areas, and then determining the value of it, and then determining the goals of it. And let me just give an example on a calls for service. I think you raise a good point about how far apart some of these jurisdictions are, and the risk you have if we have too many folks, for example, on the east side when we need more people in Burbank, as an example. And I would argue that 4th of July, we know we need more people on the east side than we do perhaps in Burbank, or, I mean, there's probably any number of things that we learn throughout the year. So on these two, I would like to encourage you to do the deeper dive analytics. And if you need more software or more help, I would want to know how to help you get there. And on the response times, let me just make this point. I get that we have contracts. I get that that is a key component of how we maintain our relationships with cities, and I think that is critical. But some of the planning I think that you all are doing now, and I know we're taking a look at this with fire too, is that there may be some areas where we decide that we may want to beef up staffing. And I'll give you just one example. As you all know, we're adding more services to that Center Road area. And San Jose PD's been pushing back on us that the city of San Jose has been pushing back on us about doing patrolling of a number of areas that they think are our responsibility. And frankly, I think they're in their jurisdiction, so I'm a little put off by the discussion. But if doing that, if by putting patrol officers that had to respond to those areas that are covering from San Antonio Valley here, that's a discussion for us to have in our partnership and relationship to the city of San Jose. And that's frankly not entirely on you, because they don't raise it just with you, they raise it with us. I think the work you're doing with VTA is another example of determining the very best way to create the response that we're going to need. I think that's going to demonstrate that in a lot of areas we're understaffed, and I think we ought to just be transparent about it. And so I'm going to suggest on this one, on items 3.1 and 3.2, that this be incorporated into your next year's work plan that's inclusive of the resources you need to get this work done. I think it's all to the good for the department that we do that. Are there concerns about what I just raised that I'm not aware of that you have?
I don't think so, Supervisor. Our biggest challenge right now is we're involved with a number of procurements, including new technology to help us with that data analysis, and that is obviously a challenge until we get there.
Right. And I guess what I would say, what I would just reflect on is if this could come back in the form of a work plan with some timelines, including what technology we do and don't have, I think we just have to say that too, because if you don't have the tools, I can't ask you to do that. If you do have the tools, then I'm going to want to see the results of that. And we'll get you the tools, I think, is what you're hearing, at least from me.
Supervisor Chavez, so I'm fine with your direction. I just want to say for the record, I'm not entirely clear on 3.1 how ESA would be as a particular agency, would be particularly useful in helping with that work. And I know you're not recommending that.
Yeah, I'm recommending this go to the staffing. I mean, I think this is part of the staffing study as well. And frankly, I'm not putting this on ESA's to-do list. Yeah, thanks for clarifying.
But I just want, because it's in the recommendation, I just wanted to say, obviously we're seeing some merit in the recommendation, but that particular aspect of who looks at it, especially since we've had it described recently as a regulatory agency, as opposed to a think tank agency on how to best do human resources. I'm
yeah,
happy.
I agree.
What I'm trying to say is I'm happy with what you're saying there. I do have.
And Dr. Smith wanted to comment on that one item.
Well, I was just going to agree. I think in order to have this information accurate, we need subject matter experts, and we don't really have subject matter experts on sheriff staffing and ESA, so I agree. The outside staffing agency would be
the
staff report.
I'm sorry, if I could just clarify that this recommendation is only to the sheriff's office, it's not to ESA.
No, but it calls for, it says, at least in my,
it does in
on my grid that is annotated by my staff, but at the end of the recommendation, it says the sheriff's office should work with employee services agency to evaluate staffing levels using a workload-based approach. And I was just suggesting, and I think what we're saying up here is I'm hearing the county executive saying, well, I'm not sure how much expertise they have in this area of law enforcement across the board, be it custody, patrol, whatever, just in that agency. Now, contracting to folks that do is, I mean, basically so that's what's happened here is we've just pushed where you get help from ESA over to the study that's being done. And I was just kind of affirming the direction that Supervisor Chavez was giving to do that. Does that help clarify
Yes.
what I was pointing at? On the 3.2, still the same subject matter. I don't even need to identify the line item on this one though, but to the sheriff's team, we've recently, I'm just a little puzzled about something that I want you to help me with. I don't want you to be quiet. I appreciate it when, especially during an audit, folks don't say, we're already doing that. We've already done that. We've already tried that. It doesn't work. And you haven't said that about measuring response times, but I've been in several community meetings, including ones where we've overlapped jurisdiction with San Jose, like along the East Foothills. In fact, Supervisor Chavez and I held a couple of joint meetings on public safety in the past, literally right on the city limit line to the unincorporated line in the McKee-Elm Rock area. And in those meetings, the captain who's there is typically able to give a very detailed, almost blow-by-blow response time report. And I remember it so clearly because, again, not to sound overly critical of San Jose, but everybody knows their response times have gone to hell in a handbasket with their reduction in officers. And so it's very stark hearing the Sheriff's Department response times neighborhood by neighborhood, call by call versus San Jose's. So my point is, great, good for you, good for us. But where does that data coming from? And what are you doing already to generate that kind of data? Because your response kind of says, well, we're waiting for more technology to do it better, but I would have never known that listening to the reports is what I'm saying. I know you're not making up the data. I'm just saying, where has it been coming from?
You know, we report our response times to our contract cities, and comparing cities to cities is very easy to do in response times. In fact, within our contracts for our contract cities, it mandates response times to certain high-level crimes. It's more difficult to do in the unincorporated area because a few outlying calls could really add to the period of time for the response. I mean, it really can make a difference if there's those anomalies.
Sure, fire has that problem too.
Yeah, and you know, another thing that was mentioned too when we look at the numbers of people and look at minimum staffing, we're also, you know, heavily considering officer safety in response to not only safety for the public, but also safety for our deputies too. So it is a little bit more difficult to compare a large geographical area with very few people and really quantify the response times, but we do have the capabilities and do that now within our contract cities.
But what I'm hearing is the technology will help articulate the information better so you can better separate rural from suburban calls and that sort of thing. Is that, I don't want to put words in your mouth. That's
No, that is true.
That's where
the RMS and the CAD system will be a tremendous help.
Got it. Okay.
Because I think that the same challenges we have with quantifying response times, county communications also has the same problem.
Yeah, I can relate, and I suppose we've actually heard that anecdotally now that you mention it from constituencies. Thank you.
You know, one other reason that I'm really interested in this particular data is that I think with one of the things we're learning with EMS and with fire response is that for accidents that happen during commute time, that, you know, depending on where the rig is, the ability to access the you know, where the situation has occurred is very difficult. And what that means to me is that we're going to have to satellite many more services than we do today in order to have appropriate response times. And that's the other reason I'm so interested in this topic, because it does make me think that we're going to have to secure resources in many more parts of the county than we do today in a number of areas. I think the sheriff is one, but certainly fire safety is another. So on the next item I wanted to take a look at was items 3.3 and 3.4. In this area, I believed, and I wanted to support the sheriff's maintenance of that flexibility, and there are a couple of reasons I'm interested in it, but one of them is that if we're tracking, and this goes back to the other issues, frankly, I'm tracking response times and needs, then maintaining some flexibility in your mechanism for staffing up or staffing down seemed very important to me. So that when I was, I wanted to leave that one, and actually even to go to 3.4 and make this point, I think we cannot forget that public safety is a people business. And while there are some folks who have no problem going online and filling out a report about their expensive bikes being stolen, there are others that's the most important thing in their life, and they want to see somebody. And I recognize this as something that's much more, it's something that we have to think about relative to the staffing plan, because the one thing I do think that the CSO officers offer is that face-to-face response. And so on this one, I felt like I still needed a lot more thinking about what happens when we refine the systems and we want to do a better job of making it available for people online. Like, to me, that part's a no-brainer, but the always who responds, that was a little bit tougher for me. Do you all want to say anything about that? And then I'll ask the sheriffs.
Sure. So we think that the sheriff's office should offer online reporting for those that wish to report crimes online. It doesn't necessarily mean that they force everyone to report crimes online. That's a policy call, and if that's what's important to them and to you all, that's fine. And the other piece of it is, I think it is really setting policies and looking at the data, because we did find that about 15% of the county's call for service were spent responding to response to burglar alarms, and 99% of those were false alarms. So that just tells me that there needs to be a look at this to say, okay, maybe there needs to be fines for people that have repeat burglar alarms. Maybe they need to be fining the companies. Something needs to be done so that they can really make the best use of those officers' time. So really, what the recommendation states is that they kind of look at these things, determine how they might be able to reduce response to minor crimes or there's unlikely to be an arrest, and implement online reporting. And the sheriff has raised the point that, it doesn't make sense to implement online reporting before the new record management system has been implemented, and we agree with that. That's fine. So we would maybe amend the recommendation to state that they should adopt it within 12 months of implementing the record management system.
Is that fine for you all?
Well, I think one thing that's important to remember, as we indicated, we do partially agree. Reducing the physical response, we do not advocate, because oftentimes, regardless of the severity of the crime, we take great pride in the fact that our deputies respond to calls for service regardless of the severity. And oftentimes, if that's a minor crime in the grand scheme of things, the presence of that patrol car driving through that neighborhood, or the presence of that deputy making contact at that residence, in and of itself is part of public safety. So we take great pride in our organization being able to have that face-to-face contact with our community that is in need of our services. So I think it's important that we really emphasize that. And to your point, Supervisor, we would not want to minimize that response time, because it goes much, much beyond the physical response of the deputy. Lieutenant?
I agree. I would just add that, kind of stepping off to that, some of the most amazing arrests or interactions that we have happen on these minor calls, and there's no way to see that in the data, because we might be responding to a simple alarm call and find a suspicious vehicle down the street, and they may or may not be related, and suddenly we have an arrest for a crime in progress. The responding into the community has a huge benefit. It encourages community engagement. It's probably one of the best times to talk to neighbors, to have those positive conversations, for those neighbors to flag you down about the stolen vehicle around the block or whatever those situations are. And I was a training officer for the majority of my career, and those simple 911 hangups or alarm calls were the bread and butter that got trainees the best experience and got exposed the best to the community.
So two things, and I want to make sure. I think there's a little more agreement here than maybe not, but on the comfort level of once CRMS is in, that we make online, people being able to report online or get their, sometimes they just want the insurance claim because they're done. They just want to go get their bike and get a new bike, which I think a lot of those ones tend to be. You can upload a picture of what it was and all that. So you're comfortable with the 12 months after that we would have an online, the capacity for online reporting? Yes? Okay. And then the follow-up to that I would suggest is that I wonder, other cities have done the false alarm fines for false alarms and for faulty alarms. Is that something that is in the cities that you're in already? Do you know?
Thank you, Supervisor. The false alarm reporting is something that is tracked by our patrol deputies, and they leave, when an alarm call turns out to be a false alarm, they leave warnings, so residents are aware that subsequent false alarm calls will come with billing, and so we do track those, and our accounting department actually
And so you bill them if you go out a second or a third time, or is it like third or fourth?
Yes, I believe it's the third and fourth, but I'm not 100% on what it may be.
Could you make sure that we get the policy? And here's a recommendation I would like to make, actually, through Dr. Smith, and I'm not sure the right who this should go to, but I actually think taking a look at the policies around the county is a really good idea, so we can look at the unincorporated area for a more complete policy. And there are two issues here. One is that we have a lot of people they're just learning how to use their phones and their alarms. So I think probably after Christmas you have a lot of people going, oh, new gift and big problem, which is, setting off their own alarms. But I'd be really interested in seeing if we could do something that was similar to other jurisdictions. And the reasons I mention this, gentlemen and ladies, I'm just looking at you two right now, though, but the reason I mention this is that it appears to me that the businesses where they may have business locations in different cities, that one piece of complaint I have gotten is the incongruous, like we're not aligned, and so people are like, in this area I don't have this, and that area I do, and so taking the biggest business districts and taking a look at their policies are probably what I would want us to take a look at.
Yeah, I'll ask Martha to collate the policies between the cities and give us an idea of how they deal with false alarms.
Yeah, because I do think we need to make people responsible for that. Thank you.
And Supervisor, where did you leave off on the online? Because again, I just want to make sure the language in the recommendation it seemed a little different than what we heard in the oral report. My copy here says to save an estimated net value of $357,842, reduce the physical response by sworn staff to certain types of calls for service, such as minor crimes. Through the use of online reporting and so forth, and I didn't hear that I didn't read that as optional.
I just made one up for us. Okay, so what I'm saying is not what they're recommending, and not even really their response. What I'm suggesting is that in fact we do give the online option, that once they have the the RMS system in place, that a year later, people should have the option to go online and file a report, and that we do take a look at the false alarm challenge. But to be frank with you, the reason I can't think that we can do any of this is that, short of getting the staffing study and the response times, these are all really linked together, and I wouldn't want to change any other policies until we do those two things.
Okay, and I
Is
just
that
as-
okay?
Yeah, it is. I just, as somebody, you know, if this may take a year to implement or something, and I won't be on the Board of Supervisors, but I'll still be living in an unincorporated area, and I could just say from a personal standpoint, having lived in the city of San Jose for 17 years prior, they went to an almost mandatory online option. I would not want to see that mandated in the county option. You know, somebody decides, anyway, we've already talked about it, but there's certain types of things where somebody may just want to go online, as the auditor was just saying in the oral presentation. I agree with that wholeheartedly. But the sheriff's response time, frankly, in the areas in my district that I'm used to observing and hearing from constituents on is outstanding. And, you know, I just want to make sure it's kept that way. I think that's what's the term? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So, I trust that you and the Board of Supervisors in the future will pay close attention to that no matter what comes back. But,
Well, more importantly, trust Maya. She's taking notes, so we're in
all
good
right,
shape.
thank you. We'll trust Maya.
Supervisors, one more thing on the alarm calls. There are other agencies that, because of such a high false alarm rate, don't respond to these types of calls for service, but including one locally here. But the Sheriff's Office believes it is important to respond to these because burglars.
I don't think we're not suggesting otherwise, Ken.
Yeah, the word
Yeah.
gets out, and we just want to say that we think it's important to respond and also to collect fines when someone's not being responsible about maintaining their alarm.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement with you. Actually, as somebody who set those alarms off on accident and then on purpose, I want you to respond to everyone. So, okay. So if we can move then to item 4.1, and this is page 8 of 9.
Excuse me, Supervisor. I thought that you had spoken also about recommendation 3.3, and I don't know if you
Yes.
wanted us to speak
Sure,
to that
if
at
you would
all.
like, if you would like to, that would be great. I jumped over it because I was agreeing with the sheriffs, but if you want to weigh in, I think that's totally appropriate.
I would like to start off by saying that our recommendation to delete 6 vacant deputy sheriff positions to reflect contracted service levels and seasonal staff patterns in Parks Patrol wouldn't actually impact staffing levels or the existing practice of how they staff these positions. It's a little technical why we're recommending it, so I would like to explain. So the 2 of the positions that we're recommending, I guess I should back up and say that the sheriff provides contract services to the Parks Department, and they have higher staffing levels during the park's high season, like during the summer, because there's more people there, and then lower staffing levels during the winter months. So the way that they staff those positions is that they they have some seasonal deputies that are assigned to parks during the high season, and then those deputies are reassigned to headquarters patrol during the park's low season. So those are the positions that we're talking about here. So 2 of the positions that we're recommending be deleted are just technical to reflect a negotiated service reduction with the Parks and Recreation Department, which occurred in spring 2018, which eliminated 4 seasonal deputies. Basically, the department deleted 2 FTEs when they eliminated these 4 seasonal deputy positions because they bill the Parks Department for 0.5 FTE for these seasonal deputies. The thing is that those positions are budgeted as full FTEs, so they had 4 FTE positions for these 4 seasonal deputy positions, and they only deleted 2. So we're saying 2 should just be deleted to reflect that negotiated service change. So that's 2. The remaining 4 actually reflects how they staff these positions. As I mentioned earlier, they have 4 seasonal deputies that are assigned to parks half the year, and they're assigned to headquarters the other half the year. The thing is that they have 4 positions in Parks Patrol for these staff and 4 positions in Headquarters Patrol, and they move between these positions for half the year, which basically means that Headquarters Patrol has 4 vacancies during the Parks high season. Parks Patrol has 4 vacancies during their low season. So they're just trading 4 vacancies back and forth. So we're just saying get rid of 4 positions so that you're not always carrying 4 vacancies between these 2 patrol areas, but it wouldn't actually impact staffing levels.
Supervisor, my understanding of it is quite a bit different in that we have essentially those positions they're not in both divisions. They're in one division, and they get transferred in the season to parks. It doesn't necessarily leave vacancies in Headquarters Patrol. We use those positions. Obviously, we can't hire 1.5 or a half a deputy for a summer season, so they come out of a division, whether that be Headquarters Patrol or more commonly our court division, to fill those FTEs within the parks codes.
If I could direct you to the analysis in our audit, on page 57, we kind of show the vacancy levels in Headquarters Patrol and Parks Patrol. I don't know if you have the audit in front of you, but we did do really detailed analysis, which the sheriff didn't respond to any items in our analysis. But we do show the vacancy levels in each, and you can just sort of see them trading these vacancies back and forth. And we also looked at the position detail, and we could sort of see that one staff was assigned to one position in Parks Patrol for half the year, and then another different position in Headquarters half the year. Not that the FTEs were being positions themselves were being transferred between Parks and Headquarters.
Okay, well, I haven't had enough coffee for that. So here's what I'm going to recommend. What you're asking us to parse between is what research you did and what you think, how we think we use the positions. And oddly enough, I see Dr. Smith leaning in, but what I was going to say is that this is one area that if maybe what we could do is get ESA to look at that because seems more of a technical thing. And the truth of the matter is I read the whole report that you did. I just read it a while ago. And so I'm listening to you saying that sounds familiar, but I don't know that I read it and was like, oh my God, I totally get that. So yes, Dr. Smith.
It would be OBA.
Okay. Then.
I mean, I hate to take sides, but the auditor has it correct in terms of how the budgeting occurs. So we'll do a report back to the board or to the committee from OBA about how the positions are filled and moved around.
And just to look at this one item would be great.
Right,
Thank you. Right.
I
would appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you for getting my attention on that. So then if we could go to 4.1. And this is another one that when I read it, I felt like I may not actually understand exactly the problem we're trying to solve here. So do you mind if you all start, and then if the Sheriff's Department, if you don't mind just giving us your thoughts.
4.1, right?
Yes, thank you.
So,
it's on page 8 of 19 on the grid.
So when deputies are assigned to the investigations division, according to department policy, they're supposed to go through an 80-hour training course within 6 months of that assignment. And so when we looked at it, what we found was that about a quarter of the staff assigned to investigations had not completed that course within 6 months. And so the original recommendation was to have everyone complete that course prior to beginning their assignment to hit the ground running. But I see that the sheriff does disagree with that for operational concerns. So perhaps a possible action that the committee could take would be to amend the recommendation so that that there's a report back by the sheriff to demonstrate that everyone assigned to investigations has completed the required course, so that they are sufficiently trained to complete their duties in that assignment. So maybe a report back in a year or two annually for the next couple of years to just show that, you know, those people are getting the training per department
Within a
policy.
reasonable amount of time.
Yeah.
I would just say that the Sheriff's Office absolutely believes it's important to ensure that our detectives are adequately trained to do the positions. POST, which is the Peace Officer Standards and Training requirement, is that this be done within 1 year of the assignment, and that is the goal that our office has sought to do based on past practice. And it really is not feasible to do that before a detective comes to the Bureau for a couple of reasons, but generally, I mean, they're in other assignments, and then there's a testing process generally right at the end of the year that will determine movement for the following year, and that's when deputies are moved into Detective Bureau. And then generally, once those detectives are selected, even sometimes even before they've gone to the Detective Bureau, the post-training classes statewide are looked at, and obviously we're always trying to send deputies somewhere close, which is fiscally reasonable and responsible. But they're also limited in their capacity because we compete with law enforcement agencies all over the state. So we generally do have all of our detectives trained within that post 1 year standard, and it's something we continue to do. And if the board wanted a report back annually to say how many detectives we have and how many are trained, that shouldn't be too difficult to provide.
I think that would be great. And you're already doing, you're doing a lot of training, I mean, actually. So you're already doing those report that I think goes to public safety and justice on your annual training. And I would just add this in. And I think that's what you're recommending. I think that's great resolution.
Yes.
Very good. You comfortable with that, Dave?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the next section that I want to go to is I apologize, I think I skipped a page, is to go to page 10 of 19. And this was a whole area that that really has to do with the courts. And one thing I apologize that I neglected to do before this meeting was to have a discussion with the presiding judge, which is normally what I would have done to prepare. And what I was thinking about with these items would be that there would be value in us getting feedback directly from the courts and the court administrator on this, and then that we could fold whatever feedback they give us and maybe bring this discrete part back when we hear about the staffing study, so we keep it in our work plan. Is that okay with everybody as a next step?
Yeah, no objections.
Okay.
And how are we defining that? I'm not on
I'm
the
sorry,
same
this is
page number.
this is 10 of 19, and this is all of the, from 5-1
Right.
to 5-5 is all the courts. And I meant to, I apologize, I just meant to talk to them and neglected to do that. But we'll make sure we do that before the next meeting. And then what I was suggesting is when we have the discussion about the staffing study, that we'll reconsider that section, because
So
we'll have
table
input.
it until then.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Great.
Thank you.
And then if we could go to item 11 of 19. This one, if I could just hear from both of you on this one, it seems very important, and there's a partial agreement, but I think here what I want to understand is the disagreement and how to remedy that. And I'm on page 11 of 19 and 12 of 19, and this is item 6.4.
Just for information, Supervisor, our page numbers do not line up, but
Oh, I'm sorry.
But our item numbers do.
Okay, so I'll
thank
stay
you.
with the 6.4. I was saying, okay, sorry about that. Thank you for telling me that. So did you want to start? Thank you.
So this recommendation is related to a backlog in Blue Team reports. I'm going to explain to you what those are briefly. So the department implemented Blue Team, which is an electronic system that captures and tracks critical incidents. So basically, staff will report critical incidents like I had to use force, or I was in a vehicle pursuit, or I was in a vehicle accident. And this is the way for the department to sort of monitor those incidents and investigate them if necessary, and then also identify any trends that might need to be addressed to be proactive in managing critical incidents. So they could say, hey, we're noticing a spike in use of force in this one division. Maybe there needs to be training in that division, or maybe we need to institute a new policy. It's really a way for the department to be more proactive in how they manage critical incidents rather than responding after the fact. So Blue Team is a way to monitor and track those critical incidents. And we noted a backlog in Blue Team reports. Basically, there was a backlog of 2,900 reports that required review. And this was an issue because the review process captured or corrected for errors in the data. And so if you have this huge backlog of reports that contain errors, that means that your data is bad. So it means that the data you have on vehicle accidents or use of force incidents in Blue Team wasn't reliable. Another major issue with this is that this data feeds into the department's early warning system, and that's the way that they flag any staff that maybe have a high level of use of force incidents or complaints against them. It's the way that they kind of address those issues before they result in major incidents. So the department is stating that they've corrected the issue that resulted in the Blue Team backlog through automated process to transfer these reports automatically into the system so that they don't have to be reviewed. But that doesn't necessarily address our underlying concerns about the quality of the data. And if you're automatically just transferring these reports and you're not fixing the data, it means that you're not really meeting the goals of this system in the first place. So basically what we would ask is that we're allowed to verify that the issue's really been resolved, because it really hasn't been demonstrated to us. And so we have some requests for additional documentation just so that we can confirm that the issue's been resolved. The first would be a statement that describes the current condition and the review procedures to ensure that that information's accurate. The second would be screenshots of the system showing kind of the number of reports awaiting review and the age of the oldest report awaiting review, so that we can confirm that there isn't a large backlog anymore. And the third would be sort of summary statistics for each incident type by year since the system was adopted in 2016, so we can say, hey, now that you say that the system's been fixed, what does the data actually look like? So that's what we would ask.
Let me start explaining, our supervisor, by explaining kind of the difference between IA Pro and Blue Team, because I think there's an important understanding of where that backlog occurred. Because I'll start by saying that the concept or idea of having a backlog in our IA workflow is obviously problematic and not something that we're looking to have. Our goal is to have that information flow as quickly as possible. So there's two kind of components to our internal affairs software. One is IA Pro and the other one is Blue Team. And IA Pro is the case management system that internal affairs uses. Blue Team is the early warning collection system. And although they're the same vendor, they're kind of disparate systems. So in this particular case, Blue Team holds all kinds of different submissions, including the ones that the auditor mentioned, such as use of force, vehicle accidents, but it could also be other more routine things like damaged uniforms, all kinds of day-to-day kind of employee reports go through this process. It's our current electronic workflow. So it starts from a deputy, it will go to their supervisor, and usually to their lieutenant, potentially to their captain for approval. And there's a workflow for each type of event. As it works through that workflow within Blue Team, there's approval processes and reviews. And at some point, depending on the type of incident, it's approved at a divisional level, usually by the captain. At that point, that Blue Team entry is deemed complete and goes into a queue to be imported into IA Pro, so that data can be available for more analytical and early warning systems within our internal affairs unit. A lot of the reports that are coming through, the pure mass quantity because of how we've chosen to deploy Blue Team, they don't review. They're not internal affairs cases. They're simply submissions that go into that employee's profile as, because we want to know, for example, how many damaged uniforms did they have? How many pieces of property? These different things that occur within the life cycle of an employee. In any extent, the complication started because IA Pro requires a IA investigator to approve and review each one of those Blue Team entries as they come through, regardless of whether they've been previously approved by a captain or somebody higher within the organization in the Blue Team application. The backlog are not internal affairs cases. They're not cases that are pending for IA. They're essentially electronic documentation of an incident that go into that employee's overall profile within IA Pro. What we've done to try to fix this is we've worked a lot with the vendor to automate that process so that when the completed Blue Team entry comes in, which has already been vetted by a supervisor, usually mid-level such as a lieutenant and a captain, comes into IA Pro, it's automatically imported and available for access by IA and also by the early warning system. So when we say that we have automated the backflow by essentially an automated process to approve those into IA Pro, that's what we're describing. We're not automating the approval of them. That still goes through the normal chain of command within our Blue Team workflow. And by making that automated as the entries come in, internal affairs and others are able to see those in real time, opposed to them sitting in a backlog, which is what was occurring until an investigator could just simply click on it and say yes, click on the next one and say yes, for a number of, say, routine entries that are not of interest for internal affairs to be reviewing. As I mentioned, these don't impact the internal affairs investigations or cases. Those come through either a different manner into IA Pro, or in the case of Blue Team, if I highlight and indicate that they're going directly to internal affairs, they'll go directly into the queue for internal affairs. So for example, if I'm a supervisor reviewing a report and there's something which I believe requires immediate attention, I would go to my captain and my captain would route that directly to internal affairs, and it wouldn't sit in that backlog. Our ultimate goal here, and we've been working with the vendor, is to better integrate those two solutions, and the vendor is on the same exact path, so that Blue Team and IA Pro work more connected and don't have to have that workflow or that process.
So two things that I'm going to say. When I'm looking at this item, this is 6.4. It's also 6.7, which is where I think you were reading the next steps off of. Am I correct?
No, I have new next steps in response to what they've, the department's asserting that it's been resolved, and I would just like to see some evidence kind of showing that.
You did say that in your before, so I heard you say that. But what I'm asking is that when I look at items 6.4 and 6.7, they seem very similar. Let me tell you the step I'm trying to get to here. I think that one of the most critical discussions that the Blue Ribbon Task Force had was around the early warning process. And I understand, I'm fascinated that we have a vendor that is having trouble merging two systems that they created, but that just makes me feel like, everybody always says business is better than government. This is one of those examples, not so much. So, but when I want to make sure I understand exactly what you're saying. And I understand you're saying good, but verify. But just so I understand what you're saying is that you today have a strategy for eliminating the backlog and have an internal human workaround to the Blue Team software not working the way we want it to work today. Is that accurate?
Yes, Supervisor. So essentially what it does is if a Blue Team entry has been approved by the division, by a captain, it automatically accepts it into IA Pro without an internal affairs investigator also approving it.
Okay. And has that currently addressed the backlog, or are you still addressing the backlog?
That removes the backlog between the two systems.
So we have no backlog anymore?
Correct. Between
Okay.
Blue Team and IA Pro, there's no backlog.
Okay, there's two different issues. Between the internal affairs and the Blue Team, between that, there's no backlog. But is there a backlog for entry into the system? Just based on the way you described it, it takes everything. It sounds like it's more of a receptor of all activities.
There's always going to be pending cases that are still waiting for the next person to review, such as...
How big is that backlog now?
I would have to pull it up today, but it's nowhere near what the number that was listed here. It's, a few that are, if a supervisor doesn't work until Monday or captain doesn't work until Monday, on Monday they'll review the backlog from the weekend, for example.
Got it. So you're saying we're 2 days max behind. Okay.
If I may, I have some concerns about removing that control process to ensure that the reports have been completed correctly. Because if at the time of our audit, there was an internal affairs sergeant that was spending 80 to 90% of her time reviewing these reports because there was just so many errors in them. So to me, removing that review process to clear things out of the backlog doesn't solve the underlying issues with the data having a lot of errors. So I can give you a couple examples of those errors. For example, if 3 deputies were involved in a use of force incident and they all use force, they're all supposed to report it. But if they don't fill out the report correctly, that could attribute, in the end, 3 use of force incidents to each deputy instead of, they should each only have 1 use of force incident attributed to them. Other errors include the supervisor field isn't reliably filled out, so you can't see, these incidents are occurring in this division, or that data field is not reliable. So I'm concerned that the automated process to reduce the backlog isn't actually fixing the data quality issues that sort of render the system not reliable.
Many of those issues were kind of growing pains when we first started using, Blue Team, and obviously additional training and just becoming comfortable with the system has limited those number of errors. We've also changed some of the categories so that we don't have those same errors with things like duplicate use of force reporting. It's a little bit more clear now. We have, for example, one officer who is a witness and another officer who may have used the force and separated those out, whereas initially those were the same, reported in the same fashion. But most importantly, what we've done is we've changed instead of having that sergeant spend the majority of her time reviewing those cases manually, we've really focused on ensuring that the captains within the divisions ensure that their Blue Team entries are correct for their entire division before they approve them and submit them to internal affairs. And that's been our goal, is to move that to that divisional level and let IA do what they should be doing, which is investigating those cases that have merit for them to be looking at. That doesn't mean they don't have access to them. The goal of automating that is as soon as that they're approved, they're in the internal affairs application and accessible by internal affairs. Additionally, we have numerous other review processes that look at serious use of force, including our use of force review board, our shooting review board, etc. So there's a number of areas where they're double checked and processed, and obviously we look in our early warning system for odd numbers or ways that, something errored out, each division has access to their early warnings and look at them. And obviously, if there was a high number for an employee, we're going to look at why that occurred before acting on it. And conversely, if somebody has no numbers, we have a very good understanding and knowledge of our employees within those divisions, and that's why keeping it at the division level has the best access to the data and be able to verify it independently.
So here's what I'm going to recommend. On item 6.4 and item 6.7, what I'm going to recommend is that we have a presentation here of the way the process actually works now, like with the changes that you've made to it, along with the workflow. Just so we understand where's the human part, what does it all look like now, and I think the reason I am just going to ask for Dave for your indulgence on this is that of the Blue Ribbon Commission Task Force initiatives, this was actually one that was of most interest to them, and really there were two issues on the early warning. To be blunt, there was wanting to better understand whether or not there could be earlier interventions around training for officers, particularly young officers. And I think, Lieutenant, as a field training officer, you probably had experiences where having the ability to course correct right at that time had a lot more value than waiting till something becomes a cultural or a core component of the way a person comports themselves. So one is that, what the Blue Ribbon Commission was interested in was being able to do early intervention and training. It wasn't simply discipline, and it wasn't to fire people. It was to better be able to say, when we see this set of activities, we know that this person may need more support. The second part of it was that we would better understand what the red flags are that we don't yet know in someone's record that could lead them to be someone either who needs training or needs to not be in our employment anymore. So anyway, I think it's worth a deeper dive of better understanding what you just told us about the system. I think the point you raise about being able to do an assessment of the quality of the data is also very valuable, and I want to recommend that both happen before you come back. So both there's an assessment of the data and that you come back with the workflow and with some screens that we can take a look at. Is that all right with you, Dave?
Yes.
Great. All right. You're okay? All right. So we're going to move on then to page, actually just to the bottom. Wait, let me get to, I'm sorry. That's right. I apologize. Item 8.4. This one, I really wanted, I want to hear both the, both from Harvey Rose, and I'm particularly interested in hearing, I want to hear 8.4 and 8.5 together because they seemed linked to me, and if they're not, please say so. But 8.4 is the changes in basic academy content. And then 8.5 is a report on the board of the graduating cohort retention, which I think fits a little bit into the discussion we had earlier about doing that dashboard so we know where people are in our process. But I don't know if you all want to start or not.
Yes, sorry, we're just catching up, sorry. So recommendation 8.4, this section is on the department's training program. This recommendation basically states to determine whether changes in the basic academy content may be resulting in fewer successful recruits after basic training, as suggested by initial data, track staffing results of revised basic academy standards. If the change results in more field-based failures, the sheriff should restore standards to 2016 levels. And we have reviewed the sheriff's response, and I can speak to that. I also want to just bring your attention to figure 8.9 on page 125 of our audit report, which shows the Enforcement Academy program retention from 2006 to 2017. And as you'll see at the bottom, this is the kind of the data that caught our attention was the class end date November 2017, where the percent graduating rose to an unprecedented 95%. And initially looking at that, you would initially think that's a positive development, but on the other hand, it's our understanding that the success of those graduates after Academy was much lower than previous classes. Unfortunately, we were not able to obtain the details about the changes made to the Basic Academy curriculum in 2017, and therefore were unable to verify the Sheriff's Office claim that the curriculum change was mandated by the California Commission of Peace Officer Standards and Trainings, or POST. We do understand that the changes made in 2017 regarded a decrease in the amount of simulated stress recruits faced during the orientation to Basic Academy, which allowed for a higher completion rate. We do believe that the Sheriff's Office should review the specific change or other changes that are not mandated by POST with the goal of more successful recruits after basic training. And so I don't want to, just to kind of paraphrase the Sheriff's response, and I'll let them kind of speak to it more directly. My understanding is that their response is the changes in the curriculum were mandated by POST. They have to follow POST standards, and therefore they can't make changes to the curriculum. So what our kind of adjustment to our recommendation is saying, review the specific change or changes that have been made in the curriculum that are not mandated by POST, if there are any, and then review those with a consideration of more successful recruits after basic training. So that's 8.4.
Yeah, before we go to the sheriff, and what was your standard for success after training? I'm sorry, I don't have that
okay.
detail in advance.
So figure 8.10 at the top of page 126, we have that on an annual basis, which shows 2014, 2015, 2016, and 2017, and you'll see in the last column the percent of failures goes from 13% in 2014 and 2015. It did go down in 2016, but then went up to 28% in 2017.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. In terms of a reference.
So I don't know if you want me to, there was another, I think, recommendation. I don't know if you wanted me to speak.
Why don't we stop on 8.4,
Okay.
let the sheriff respond, because there's a lot there, and then we'll move on to the next one, even though they're linked in some ways, as Supervisor Chavez said. Please.
Okay, so I think it's important to understand that the Sheriff's Office is a certified presenter of the POST Basic Academy curriculum, which is mandated by the state of California and standardized for every Basic Academy presenter throughout the state. Now, with that, we absolutely have no leeway in amending or adjusting that mandated curriculum from POST. However, as a certified presenter, we do have leeway in determining agency or academy specific training that we do to ensure that the quality of our recruits that we graduate is at a higher level and meets the needs of our client agencies. We've served multiple law enforcement agencies throughout the entire state of California who send their recruits specifically to our academy. So we are constantly evaluating the academy curriculum that we do have control over to ensure that we're meeting not only the demands and needs of our client agencies, our own agency, but also the changes in the profession, the changes that our officers and deputies face today in the community are much different than what they faced 22 years ago when I started. So there are constant changes that we are implementing in how we manage our academy. purely because we have that ultimate responsibility to the state and to our client agencies to ensure that the recruits that we graduate are competently able to go into a field training program at that level. Another important distinction is we don't have any control over the quality of the recruits that are hired and sent to our academy by our client agencies. And we also don't have any control over how a particular recruit may apply the academic and simulated training that they receive in the academy to the real-world environment within a field training program. At the end of the day, the post requirements and our academy requirements are to place that graduating recruit into a field training program with a level of competency to now take on that additional training to become a solo beat officer or deputy. And there are always going to be many variables that come into play that will not allow us to guarantee a certain number of success, not only in the field training program, but also in the academy. We do track attrition. We follow the state guidelines when it comes to the tone that we sent in the academy based on the generational changes that we're seeing throughout the state, making sure that we're not too heavy-handed at the beginning of the academy, scaring recruits away, but at the same time balancing to make sure that the recruits that are coming into this profession understand the realities, the real dangers, and the real responsibilities that come along with it. So it's a balance that occurs throughout the entire state. Every post-basic academy presenter is dealing with those same ongoing revisions to how that academy is managed. And we take that very serious, and that's why in this particular case we partially agree because we do make those ongoing adjustments. But to try to revert to a specific level of standard as highlighted in here in 2016, there's so many variables that will determine whether or not a particular class has a high percentage rate of graduates or a lower one. Sheriff?
If I can also add that the tests that are administered in the academy are not our tests. They are tests that they actually take online with the state, and the pass-fail rate is set by the state, and the state is the one that does the correcting of the testing. So we have nothing to do with the testing standards. We also add a lot of additional training into our academy, like CIT, first responder training, additional firearm training. But the washout rate and the failure from the academy are generally on the state mandated and controlled testing.
And I also will say that another component here that isn't highlighted in the audit that's part of our ongoing review is the quality of instruction, the quality of our instructors. And after each learning domain, the recruits complete instructor evaluations to give us an opportunity to evaluate the competency and the value that that instructor may bring to a particular topic. And based on that, we make changes with our instructional staff as well to ensure that we're constantly providing the best product we can. But to answer the question of maybe having a higher washout rate in the academy will result in a higher success rate in the field training program, I wouldn't agree with that because, again, I'll go back to a recruit's success in the academy of academics and simulated training is much different than actually in the field confronting real-life situations and dynamics within the community.
Before Supervisor Chavez inquires further on these, is the table, the figure 8.9, covers more than just the differential between the last couple of years. It's about a dozen years, and it just seems like the numbers are all over the map in terms of, on a percentage basis, graduates and so forth. And I heard the part about who gets to do the testing and the correcting and all. Sounds like trying to pass the bar exam or something. But that said, do you have any theory as to why? And I don't mean it's not necessarily pointed at something internal to your department, given what we just heard. But what would be your best theory as to why you'd get that kind of relatively severe undulation or fluctuation, 68 to 81, year by year, 64 to down to 41, up to 82. I mean, that was some years ago, not just the last couple of years. Why does it do that?
In my opinion, with my experience, Supervisor, a combination of two things. Number one would be oftentimes when a new officer or deputy is hired, where they're given that hiring opportunity to attend the academy, sometimes those decisions are made where this person clearly has demonstrated through the life that they've lived up to that point, highlighted in the background, that they already inherently have skill sets that are conducive to success in this profession. Others may not, but we see other values in that individual where we feel that the academy may be an environment that could enhance and train certain skill sets that they may not already have. Sometimes those decisions of hiring that individual, whether it be our organization or any other agency that sends recruits to our academy, sometimes those decisions don't end up panning out the way that we had hoped. And they determine very early on in the academy that this isn't a profession that they thought it was. As soon as they're exposed to the simulated environment of what law enforcement professionals are faced with. So I think that's one factor, is the initial hiring. The second factor is the makeup of the academy staff, whether it be the recruit training officers themselves.
I heard that earlier, yes.
Or the sergeant. So again,
how about economic conditions? I mean, you've gone, if you look at the last dozen years, from deep recession to not, to a less competitive marketplace, if you will, or market for hire. Are the means of recruitment trying to adjust to those market conditions, from time to time? And I don't want, again, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I imagine having managed, I don't do that job here, but having managed on the private sector side, that by the time you figured out the market was changing one way or the other, you'd have to then modify your recruitment process or your expectations on recruitment, the number of the pool, kind of applicant pool that you're going to get, and then proceed with a different approach until the next change. So you could go from 300 applicants per position in 1 year, and 2 years later be at three applicants per position. But is that kind of adjustment an issue in terms of where you're going out? I know when I go to the academy graduations, people sometimes are coming from retail backgrounds and all kinds of some are military, some are retail. But I would assume, especially when they're coming from the non-governmental side, that the competition and the wages and the promotional opportunities available, or the layoffs that are happening, would have an influence on the quality that you're getting.
Yeah, absolutely. And those market trends are tracked and monitored within our recruitment unit and have a direct correlation of how we target our recruitment. And we also see oftentimes when the market declines and people have the unfortunate reality of being laid off and lack of employment, they're now churning and seeking to an opportunity in law enforcement because it's a job, in their opinion, versus a lifelong aspiration, career path to become a law enforcement professional. And oftentimes when that happens, those individuals don't have the true depth of understanding of what it is that they're seeking or getting themselves into, and ultimately not successful in the academy, or decide to voluntarily withdraw very early on in the academy. So those factors do certainly play a role.
Okay, thank you. Supervisor Chavez?
So I think what I want to, I think there are two issues or opportunities here. I think one is that I want to go back earlier to the discussion we had just about making sure that you're reporting out to the Public Safety and Justice Committee, which I think you are acknowledging that you do, but really being able to take a look at expanding the assessment of whether or not someone graduates from the academy, passes the field training office, and then taking a look at those trends in terms of how long people stay. And I think one question, and I don't know the answer to this, but it's something I'd be very interested in understanding from County Council at some point is, you know, being able to look at not just at aggregate numbers, but really being able to dive into the specific careers of folks that we're hiring will ultimately be really helpful. And I recognize we have to be mindful of employment records and all of that. So being able to take discrete individuals and not just look at aggregate numbers in terms of what happens to people when they come through the academy, where we get them, and ultimately when you do the exit interview, why do they leave? If they do the exit interview with us. So I say that because I do think we're going to, as we continue to try to compete with other agencies to hire people, to get the best and the brightest, that's going to be something that's going to be important for us to know. So I want to add that into the report out, the annual report out, that we're really taking a look at the trajectory of careers as part of the dashboard approach. Can that be done? Okay. And then the second part of it, I think that's the Harvey Rose is asking for, which I think is really just is fine, would be to take a look at the curriculum relative to post. And here's something I'd be interested, I mean, relative to what post is requiring us to do, because I think all they're asking is to verify what you've just explained. Because I think if what you're saying is accurate, which I have no reason to believe it isn't, if we're following statewide recommendations, I'm also really interested in what's happening. I mean, like being able to give post feedback too, because I feel like they're not as nimble all the time. And some of the work, for example, that you've been doing around mental health training, I think they're learning from you. And I want to say that some of the curriculum you were using, they're using now because of your work. Am I remembering that correctly?
Post has adopted a lot of the mental health curriculum that we were previously implementing in our academy. Yep.
Right. So, I mean, I think that iterative process is one that's not a bad thing to understand. But anyway, if we can verify what's post and what we've added into our own curriculum, I think would be of value.
If I can add also, I have served on the Post Commission for many, many years. I was first appointed by Governor Gray Davis and every governor since that time. And even though government is generally not agile, Post does use a lot of subject matter experts that really they continually reevaluate and restructure the basic academy curriculum. So it's something that even though they may not be agile, they're always looking at. And I'm really proud to serve on that statewide commission. And I think it's really important to law enforcement, not only just standards for law enforcement officers coming in, but the quality and content of the training.
And Sheriff Smith, is that why the investigative, the investigation classes are statewide and not local? Is that because for that reason that you just stated?
What Post generally does, or what Post does, is they will approve certain entities to provide training. Like we have certifications for a lot of different types of training classes that we've received from Post. But Post also has training where they contract with entities to provide actually the Post training, and that's what the ICI classes are. Those are contracts that Post has with entities to provide that curriculum. And sometimes those courses are really impacted with the number of presentations. There's some classes that Post offers as a Post course where the waiting list is years. It's not true with the basic and investigative course, but it is always a challenge to find one that is cost-effective, local, and available.
Thank you for that. So So I feel satisfied with 8.4 and 8.5 that you're going to start including those numbers more publicly, and you'll give us feedback on the method for doing a discrete analysis of success and failure at different parts of the process.
Supervisor, if I can just provide some clarification, we'll absolutely start reporting on that, but the numbers will be skewed to a certain degree because we won't have the ability to track what happens to our client agency recruits after completion of the academy. So we'll certainly be able to track
and maybe
ours.
the way to do the report out is to report out the number of just our recruits discreetly, because I think you raise a good point that we don't want to while we're training together, and I think there's value in that. I think that's really cost effective. I think what we're really interested in is of these academies and the folks that you're hiring, how many of them pass and graduate, how many of them go through FTO and stay with us, and then how long do they stay on average?
Not a problem.
And, one other question, too, is when you look at these numbers, we, many, many years ago, did a full academy class for Oakland. We had 50 Oakland officers that we provided training for because there's only a certain number of entities that have the certification to present the basic academy. And we've been audited by Post many times for all of the qualities and instructor credentials. And I think we're going through an audit right now from Post of the Basic Academy, and we generally have exceptional ratings from Post as far as the quality of what it is that we present. We also hear that from our partner agencies that send their recruits to us.
Great, thank you. And then on the I'm not sure I knew this. When the field on the, anyway, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I think I feel confident in the resolution here. And the resolution is you're going to do more reporting out and also allow for an audit to demonstrate that we're post, the training we're doing is, and the changes we've made are from Post. All right. Okay, so on item 8.7 and 8.7, I wasn't sure I understood the significant disagreement here, why it was a partial agree from the sheriff's office.
Supervisor, on behalf of the sheriff's office, our primary disagreement is keeping them standardized for positions such as particular ranks or, for example, investigations is problematic simply because of the specialized assignments that people have. And we already have kind of general required training, which are set by Post and also by our organization. Our goal here is to keep that flexibility within the divisions, but at the same time, obviously, have standards and requirements that are consistent for areas.
So how do you demonstrate the standards and maintain flexibility?
Well, so for example, in our investigation bureau, as trends and times change, certain trainings become relevant or more important, such as maybe technology or human trafficking. We like to keep that agile so we can adjust what the training trends are based off of what's occurring now or is common. At the same time, there's standards that are set. So for example, as you heard earlier, somebody who's assigned to our investigation bureau is required to take an 80-hour class by Post on basic investigations. If they are then assigned to, say, robbery homicide, there's an additional 80-hour class that they're required to take. And all those standards are state standards, and we follow those guidelines.
I think, so let me just ask this. When those standards change, how do we notify the staff? If, for example, if in order to get promoted or in order to get to receive incentive pay. Like where is that? Like I can go online and I can look it up and I can see what I need to do to get to the next level?
Correct. All the post standards are clearly available on Post's website. Although they're usually not tied to a particular promotion or a pay increase. Normally they're kind of after the fact. So if you get promoted to supervisor or to sergeant, you're going to go to the required 2-week supervisor school, which is required just like the investigator school within 1 year of being promoted.
All right. Any comments that you wanted to make on that item? And this is 8.7.
Just that the department has, as they kind of alluded to, there are post-required trainings, but there are also trainings that are just required internally that post has no requirement for, and that what we found was that there weren't any strong controls to make sure that deputies were completing those trainings that were internally required. So that's why we said, take a look, see what looks reasonable, and then enforce. If you're going to call it required or call it mandatory, then actually set up a system to make sure that those trainings are completed.
We also believe, too, that the division captain and lieutenant generally have a better sense for what a particular individual deputy or sergeant may need for training. And it's not the same for all the people. It varies not only on what their duties are, but it also varies on personally what would be beneficial for that person. So we leave it up to the division to determine those training needs very, very often. We're also faced with such a huge increase in mandated, legislatively mandated training, and being able to get our deputies to all their perishable skills trainings like arrest and control and driving. And there seem to be more and more mandates, both legislative and post, and what we believe is important. And our training division keeps on top of what those best trainings are, and it's always a struggle to meet the mandatory training.
But I think just on the, I think what's being said is that how do you, what's the mechanism for clarifying that for the individual, and how transparent is that both for them and for the, I understand the point you're raising, Sheriff. I'm just not understanding the way someone would know that. And at some level, it requires a level of leadership on behalf of the management staff that, frankly, managers are very also. You know, you're in the process of developing strong, good managers, and sometimes they're managing other people, and they're still learning how to manage. So how do you create that clarity?
So I'm a little confused by the word mandatory training because, you know, we do have mandatory training that is not post-required. So I'll give you
we're making you do a bunch of them. You don't have to give me examples.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So
sorry. You're welcome.
CIT is an easy example,
Yeah.
right? So that's not a post-requirement. I think everybody within our organization is very clear that CIT is a requirement for our staff. And we've sent out numerous emails and trainings and briefings, and people understand the importance of CIT training and the fact that, you know, our entire department, you know, will attend it. And that is tracked within our training. We can easily pull up a report of who has completed CIT training or active shooter or any of the other non-post required classes that may either be required because the organization, the county, legislation has mandated. And there's a lot of them, as the sheriff mentioned. You know, I just did the review for this year, and there's probably 5 or 6 additional training requirements that are added on to for next year. Our training software, as we mentioned, within the next 2 requirements does track those. We do have a separate indicator for what's called post-approved or post-mandated training, but that's simply just an indicator on there that that class is pro-certified.
Got it. So let me just make this point. It says here, I'm looking at 8.9. To me, these two were a little bit, they could have been together and in some respects, but it said, however, all submitted training is logged and reported, and it's logged and reported to the Training and Compliance Division. And then can anybody see it so they know everybody went through what training?
Correct.
Anybody within the organization?
Correct.
So
Our
it's an auditable thing.
Correct. Our training and compliance unit has a software that keeps a profile for each employee with all their training.
And so the manager or the leader who gets a new person under them would be able to look at all of what they've done in the last X number of years.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And also, Supervisor, if I can comment, there's a separate report that goes out monthly to every division manager with the employees that are assigned to that particular division, showing that individual compliance of staff and all of the mandated training as well as department-specific required training.
Supervisor, if I may. So there were a few other concerns that we raised with the training management system, which we don't necessarily fault the sheriff's office because that's the training system they are required by post to use. Our understanding from our review was that it's relatively good at tracking post-mandated trainings. However, they also enter non-post mandated trainings into the system, and they're not entered into in a consistent way. So it would be very difficult to pull up a report and say X% of the department or of this division have done this course, because when folks put in the course that they completed, the name of the course might change a little bit, or they might just enter different names for the same course, or the presenter might change over time. So there's not that consistency. My understanding is that you could fairly easily pull up one individual deputy's record and be able to see what they completed, but to aggregate it and look at a more global level is more difficult. So we did have another recommendation. It's in this section that speaks to, there's a field in the TMS, I think it's called the certification field, where they could maybe come up with course numbers and then enter in the course number into that field, and that would be a way of using the current system to be able to aggregate that tracking. So I don't know if...
What do you think?
Yeah, so I can comment on that. We'd be happy to show the auditors the progress we've made with the training management system. We've begun to merge that system to track all of our custody bureau training as well, which historically has been tracked in a completely separate system. So now that everything is being merged into the TMS, a lot of what was just highlighted there as far as the capabilities of tracking the individual non-mandated training are being implemented. So that's already in process, and we'd be happy to show the progress we've made.
I think that would be great if you two could look at it together. I recognize the point you're raising about using numbers because they're easier to call up and you don't have to, it doesn't, you know, if you made a mistake, you can still call it up. I mean, the other thing we've been looking at, especially with EMS right now, is using drop-down menus so that we're more specific. And so if you all would follow up on that, I think that would be great. All right, we're almost at the end. I know people are with bated breath here. This is item, I'm on, oh, it doesn't matter what page I'm on. On item 9.2, this was developing a policy that technology projects should be assigned a project manager whose responsibility to develop. I have to say, anything having to do with technology and period is, I have a little PTSD from when we talked about this a while ago. So let me just ask is, on these items, it says the sheriff's office, maybe you could just talk about why there's a significant disagreement here versus just giving a project owner a project plan scope. I mean, that seems like the direction that we should be going in. I'm not sure I understand the disagreement here. Oh, okay. It said partially, so it's total agreement. I can strike that.
My 9.2 says agree. I don't know if we're working on the...
That makes me feel happier. I'm going to move on then. On item, and then how about item 3? This is a technology governance issue.
That one's also agree now, Supervisor.
Okay.
10.1 is a disagree.
All right. So 10.1, Dave's like, you get to that, Cindy. 10.1 is our last one. Establish a vehicle selection criteria to guide future vehicle acquisition. So, go ahead.
Okay. So our audit found that the Sheriff's Office does not have department-specific written criteria for vehicle selection when acquiring new vehicles, despite the county policy requiring the development of internal standards by each department that purchases vehicles. We also found that that without criteria specific to the needs of a patrol vehicle, it was not possible for us to verify that the decision on the most recent purchase was made considering relevant, and this is pulled from the county policy, operational requirements, occupant safety, lowest overall ongoing cost to the county, and alternative fuel availability. And that's mandated by the county's Board of Supervisor Policy Manual Comprehensive Vehicle Policy, and we have the section cited in the recommendation on fleet right-sizing, acquisition, outfitting, and disposal. So we were frankly just looking at the county policy, and we asked for their internal policies, and they did not have any.
Okay.
I won't debate the whether or not we have a written policy. Our guide or our concept has always been to follow third-party industry standards, particularly with patrol vehicles, because they're tested by a number of different organizations. There's different events and reports that come out at a federal level on safety and access and visibility and all kinds of a number of different areas. And we've used those standards at a national level to kind of roadmap our purchase of patrol vehicles. We've also conducted employee surveys, road tested the vehicles. We just had the Dodge Chargers, for example, out for road tests for a number of months. Involvement of our unions. There's a number of aspects that we've done to deploy that, and to try to make the selection of vehicles meet not only our officer safety and our safety, but also the ergonomics and ease of use. We're very concerned about adding additional technology and distraction of drivers, visibility of the vehicles. A lot of the new vehicles are very small, which is problematic for larger deputies, particularly height-wise. I hit my head on both of them. It's very different than back in, say, 2005, when our only option was essentially a Crown Vic. And the vehicles have changed rapidly. So over the past couple of years, we've gone through about 3 models of vehicles because the manufacturers aren't staying consistent with kind of a direction, which is problematic. That doesn't mean we can't have a general guideline for what we're looking for in purchasing a vehicle.
Well, here's what I'm going to recommend. It's a board policy that they're pointing out that you're not following. And I recognize there are a lot of other things you're following that you're using to inform you. But here's what I would like to see. Why don't you take the board policy, the policies that you're using now, and make a recommendation back to us on how to use the framework of the board policy relative to the work that you're doing so that we have an aligned policy. Because the point they're raising, and it's not a wrong one, is that we've been looking at policies, frankly, very broadly for vehicle use throughout the county that looks at fuel efficiency, and we've got an eye toward the environment. And your point about what you do and don't fit into, I totally get, because we just bought an electric car that, putting my husband and my son in it, we had to get another bigger electric car. So but if you all could give yourselves a 3-month come back to the at FGOC with the board policy, along with the your recommendations about how it could be more suitable to the kinds of vehicles you're purchasing, I think would be advisable.
I have a very fair request, Supervisor, and we'll work with Fleet to accomplish that.
Good. And Jeff Draper wants to help.
Yeah, he does.
I see him back
He's
there.
here, ready to come up and straighten all this out, I bet. Jeff is just going to know what I'm going to bring up next, which is when you start talking about rapid, vehicle model change and technology change and so forth. I've made the argument, actually Harvey Rose has rejected it in the past, that leasing might be a better option than making a long-term capital investment in automobile technology that's changing so fast that NHTSA can't even keep up with the changes. So if you want to include any, if you don't, this isn't telegraphing to satisfy me. I've been rejected by multiple departments already, but in terms of the report that Supervisor Chavez just asked for, which I endorse, if you want to include your thoughts on, financing flexibility that might help you comport with your own policy or with these standard policies that you're talking about, or our policies, that would be helpful for me to understand. Thank you.
And I would just say that might be something we'd want Harvey Rose to take a look at, because the innovation that's happening in technologies related to automobiles is faster than almost anything I'm seeing right now. So whether it's software or the actual material being used, all of it. So Cheryl, would love your feedback on that. Okay, so Dave, we made a lot of recommendations, and rather than reviewing them, since we have a few more people here who need us to say yes so that they can move on with their lives, what I'd like to do is move all of the recommendations, and then David, I think Maya and other folks can work with you on the agreements, and we'll get those to both parties so that you can give us your feedback as well in terms of what you think the next steps are, so we can align those. And then I think we're done. And I would move that we accept the audit with the recommendations that were added today. And thank both parties very much for 2 hours.
Unanimously adopted. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for working through this with us, everyone. Appreciate all the hard work. All right, Supervisor Chavez, what do you want to race through? And is there anything you want to continue and break the hearts of the people that have been here for 2.5 hours?
No, I think we can do it. I think we can.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're on item 8 now?
We are on item 7.
We are? No, 7 was deferred. So we're on item.
6 was moved on consent. 4 was deferred, and 7 is still, at this point, is still on the agenda.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know if this was a recommendation.
7 is received, let me just call it out. It's received a report from Facilities and Fleet Department of the Roads and Airports Department relating to job order contracting. And this has been an ongoing item here before the committee. And this, as noted, referred from September 12, 2019. I know there's been ongoing work done with external, so-called third parties, building trades and so forth to sort of satisfy the committee on where we're at on job order contracting. I think the last time, Supervisor Chavez, you asked a number of questions that have been answered item by item in the response back from Mr. Draper in the written packet. And I went through them. I did not have they're factual questions and answers. I didn't have any particular, feelings one way or the other. I had a couple of question marks on some of the facts they brought forward, just in terms of how things, deeper understanding of how things work. But I didn't have the time to ask those questions before I got here. Indexing and adjustments, for example, is something I'd like to learn a little bit more about. You had asked about whether or not amounts over $5 million were up for grabs, for example, and they talked about the indexing of the original $3 million annual amount. So I don't know if you want to receive it, but reserve the right to come back and respond to it further, or
you know what? Let's do that. We'll receive it, and let me
I don't know if they want to highlight anything.
Yeah, I was going to say, is there anything that you think is still sticky? I'm a little stuck right now.
I think my colleague and I, colleague Harry Fried is here from Roads and Airports, and I don't have anything to add right now.
Could you describe any process points that you've had, just high points that you've had since last September with stakeholders, with building trades or anybody else? I mean, this was really more of us asking questions to you in the last meeting that we left open, and you came back with them. But it doesn't preclude the notion that you've had further interactions or assertions from folks that helped tee this up in the first place, kind of saying, hey, we may have some issues. And I know I was part of that early inquiry process with concerns that job order contracts might be getting broken down, piecemeal in a way that might concern board members in terms of policy, in terms of bidding policy. That said, I'm just simply asking a question. Have we gone through a lull now of where we haven't had, where we've concluded or we haven't had any further external issues or complaints coming forward? It's okay if we have.
There's been no new, there's an ongoing dialogue with Building Trades Council at times, intermittent,
okay,
on their concerns and or understanding of the job order contract and where they think this should go.
Mm-hmm.
There's been no real developments since we've met last. The most significant development is that State Bill 128 has now come into play effective on the 1st of January this year. This will allow us to enter into a best value analysis for determining who our job order contracts are. We're working with County Council to update our bidding instructions so that it matches what the state bill requires, plus determining the criteria that we'll use to make that best value selection. That would be the most significant change that's occurred.
Do we know yet whether or not that would require any Board of Supervisors action in terms of incorporating those potential alignments or realignments with the overall board policy? Because where this starts to bump into anything is really not a JOC policy. It's really the PLA and overall contracting policy that we also have to dovetail with. So I don't know if you know. If you don't know, it's okay. I was just going to ask that if that is the case, that we get a crack at it here before it goes to the board so we understand what's coming.
The board obviously will continue to adopt the bidding package before we put it out on the street. As far as the PLA, THA, targeted hiring agreement requirements, that will still be in the contract per board policy for any significant projects that we use the job order contract to do, anything over $2 million.
Okay. If any adjustments need to be made to existing policies, do that. And I appreciate you. It's exactly the kind of thing I was hoping you would surface since the last time we took this up, that the council, that instead of going directly to the board, that it would stop here first, only because we've had such a continuous loop here on studying the issue. I doubt that we'll have a lot to say here at that time, but I just want to make sure that we sort of go through that closure process of understanding any changes. And in fact, if you remind us at the time as chair, assuming I'm still chair at that time, I'll remember to either move the item to consent if it's sort of cursory information, but for our two staffs to be able to get that information would be helpful, prior to any board discussion.
Be happy to do that.
Okay.
I have one more request, and that is, if you don't mind, what I would like to do is receive the report, but I would like you to sit down with the building and construction trades prior to the January 1st deadline, just to review this, help them understand what we understand today about 128 and the implications of it. Because one thing, there are two issues that I see as overriding. One issue is that we put a bunch of our own local policies on top of the state, and really being able to understand what the implications are of all of them. But the second is that when we passed the community workforce agreement, body of work, I think that might have been 3 or 4 years ago, there were two issues that were not resolved, and one had to do with within the policy how we were going to address labor peace. I think that's still an outstanding issue, and not on your end, but this is something that County Council had been wrestling with that I don't think we've seen back. And the second thing is that when we passed the community workforce agreement, it was with this idea that we were going to be able to work with other organizations that also had a lot of construction work going on, so that we'd be able to pull foster kids and high need folks into these programs and coordinate that. And we've not yet established that that network of coordination. And that's important for folks who are trying to do jobs for us, because the idea would be that you have 10 or 15 people that you'd have enough job hours for, that it wouldn't require, that it would alleviate some of the pressure from the, pardon me, from the contractors to have to find someone that was, that we're getting a lot of people starting the program but not moving them through the program. And now VTA's accepted the community workforce agreements as a basis. The Water District has done the same, and I think one college district. And now that we have more than one partner, this is a time that we can actually invest and make the program work. Because the challenge we were always going to have was the issue that you raised with us in the beginning, is just the impact on a few contractors to kind of stand up the program by themselves. And I think that's right, but I don't think we're in that situation anymore. So the three areas of discussion: one is, let's get clarity on the labor peace language. Two, that we have a conversation with the trades that you do to have this, help them understand this better. And three, now that we have more agencies that are able to participate with the community workforce agreement and being able to use best value, gives us a lot more flexibility in terms of getting to the goals that we wanted to get to when we first set these policies in place. So if the meetings can happen before the new year, then what I'd like to do is see if we can't bring this to the full board so that the board has an understanding of, we've resolved the labor peace issues, we understand what the implications are, and allows us to at least get a recommendation from you about the next steps for the community workforce agreement.
Certainly agree with all that. The only thing I would ask is a little indulgent that it not exactly be on 1 January. It's should be more tied probably to the effect of when we finish the bidding instructions and we have something ready to show them, I think, which will be shortly here after the first of the year, but it won't be.
Got it. The only challenge I see with that is that if the bidding instructions don't reflect everybody's understanding, then we're going to have a discussion about the bidding instructions.
Oh, no, I meant that we would have the meeting before we would even bring the bidding instructions to you. Yes.
That would be great. That would be really good. Is that okay with
yeah,
you, Dave?
so they'll reach out to building trades. They'll come back. They'll do a quick stop here to let us know how things turned out, and then continue on to the board. So
yeah,
the
is that all right?
board can understand.
Okay. Thank
all right.
you.
All right, good discussion. And so
Thank
we'll
you very
just
much.
we'll receive the report and then keep the item on the agenda essentially for the January CSFC meeting on the hope that they're ready. Thank you. Item 8. This is a report from the Office of the Clerk relating to contract for management audit services and forwarding the Board of Supervisors consideration direction to the clerk whether to issue a request for proposals or prepare a single source agreement with Harvey Rose. This is kind of a perennial issue that comes up. Megan, you want to clarify it for the world, what we're doing here?
Megan Doyle, Clerk of the Board of Supervisors. As you are aware, the auditors, the management auditors, Harvey Rose Associates, LLC, are employed by the Board of Supervisors directly. The chair of FGOC is the contract manager. The clerk's office handles the administrative side of the contract, billing, et cetera. We're here because the contract is coming up, and I do want to correct a typo in the ledge file under reasons for recommendation. I apologize. The current contract, as is explained, the current contract with Harvey Rose expires on June 30th of 2016, but the four one-year new renewal options have been exercised. That then takes us to actually October of 2020. Mm-hmm. So why we're here today is to seek the board's input, because this is the board's contract and it's unique in that fashion, as to whether or not you want the board wants to proceed with a competitive procurement process, or whether we want to authorize a sole source agreement with Harvey Rose.
Yeah,
and this is the time frame in which we sort of need to make that decision.
Right, so you have the lead time to prepare. My inclination from this committee's, today perspective would be, meaning with deference to the Board of Supervisors, would be that we pick an option and we forward it today. And the option I would pick, obviously the board can overturn that and go in a different direction, would be to to negotiate next year a single source agreement with Harvey Rose rather than go to a competitive bidding process. But I suppose we could do it either way, or we could go with no recommendation, Supervisor Chavez, if we disagree, and ultimately, you agree? So we will forward to you and hereby and to the full Board of Supervisors at whatever the next opportunity is to get it on the agenda, perhaps after the first of the year, a recommendation from this committee that we stick with a single source agreement with Harvey Rose and subject to Board of Supervisor deliberation.
Thank you.
Okay, thank
That
you.
was the direction we needed.
Okay, thank you. And then item 9 is to receive the report from the Office of County Executive relating to procurement transformation and countywide contracting.
Good afternoon, Miriam Singer, Chief Procurement Officer. With me today are Andrew Zavoyski, Director, Office of Countywide Contracting Management, and Amy Sardella, Financial and Administrative Services Manager.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
There are 2 typos that we'd like to correct, please, if I can. On page 9, under Procurement Recruitment Update, the 3rd line, remove the word "the" between "and" and procurement, please. And also on page 9, the last paragraph, the 3rd line, instead of serviced, should be services with an S instead of a D. I apologize and thank you.
You waited here all this time just to correct those 2 typos?
Actually, just to answer any questions that you might have.
Right. Is there anything that you want to highlight? Obviously, the report's well written. Our staffs have looked at it, and you've captioned everything nicely in terms of kind of a highlighting of what you focused on. But anything you want to add, either to draw out something or draw something to our attention that's in the report that we may have missed, or just to augment what's in the report?
Yes. This report is the culmination of 2 years of work in the county's enterprise-wide procurement transformation. We have begun a process that has resulted in significant value to the county in terms of the quality of our contracts, the structure of the procurement organization, as well as the savings and price aspects of contracting throughout. There is much that has been accomplished, but there is much more to be done. And this is my last FGOC meeting, and I wanted to take the opportunity to thank you, board members, the administration, Mr. Marquez County Council, our budget director as well. This has been an extraordinary experience, and I am very, very energized and inspired by the work of this community and this government on behalf of the people it serves. I leave you with very strong leaders. Andrew Zavoyski will be the interim CPO, and with Teresa Thorilis, Director of Procurement, with the able hands of Amy Sardella in carrying on into the future and bringing this process to greater levels. There is much to be done in the area of technology and also in terms of structural improvements. Significant work has been done in building trust and opportunity with our community-based social services providers, and I believe that we are well poised to continue to grow that relationship in a more positive way, focused on client and patient outcomes, and also considering the needs of social service providers that are unique to this community alone. So in sum, we'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have, but I'm delighted to have had the privilege and opportunity to work with you. Thank you very much.
Likewise, and we'll give you the initial thank you and congratulations at this moment. But thank you for your service to the county, to the board, and to this committee. Appreciate it very much. Supervisor Chavez, anything you want to inquire upon or comment upon?
Thank you. I had just a couple of things. So first of all, happy last meeting. Congratulations. And I'm sorry to be losing you, but I'm pleased you get to be with your family. I mean, what a tough choice, and appreciate you stayed with us as long as you did, honestly, with your family so far away. A couple things I more just want to just share really with the staff, and one is that I really have appreciated the flexibility and the work that you've done with our departments to help departments achieve their goals, and doing it in a really cost-effective way, and being ruthless about protecting public money. Like that is so critical. So thank you for that. The issues I wanted to make sure I highlighted are really two-part. One is that our contracts and our contracting services are one of the best opportunities we have to do a better job of quantifying our community impact. And what I mean by that is that just the sheer volume of contracts that get negotiated through your office is tremendous. And we do have very significant benchmarks we want people to achieve and accomplish. And we have been trying to figure out, and I know Greg has really given a lot of thought to this, about how we incorporate benchmarks in the budget process so that we know if we're increasing a contract by $100,000, we're buying $100,000 more what. And we really don't do that yet. But I think with the improvements that have been made under Miriam's leadership and the team, and I also think just the opportunity for more technology that's going to help us do that in some respects really better understanding long term how the technological improvements and your ability to quantify what we're buying can really be more reflected in our overall budget process. Because one of the only times we understand your impact is when we're looking at this and we can see, you saved $72 million in 2018 through your procurement processes. And that's awesome. What I'd love to be able to say is, and we bought these units of service. And I'm not sure the exact way to get there, but I think you've moved us closer. And anyway, so I want to highlight that because I think procurement is going to be one of our best partners in really starting to change our purchase strategies. The second thing I just wanted to acknowledge is that you have had an eye toward how to help lots of nonprofits get better at engaging with us. And I just want to make sure that keeps going even after Miriam's not here. And again, I want us to have partnerships with our nonprofit partners, like meaningful partnerships. I'm not trying to squeeze them and squeeze the dimes out of them. I do want us to be able to create much more sophisticated relationships so that we can say to somebody with $100,000, if you're going to help X number of people, what's the approximate dosage, on and on, all of that. And again, I think through some of the work we're doing now with some of these small nonprofits, I think it's where we could start, even with them, building them up to where some of our larger nonprofits are that we can already have those kinds of negotiations with. So thank you for helping us with the small ones. And I'll just say, Miriam, I don't know who's going to be the lead on the little project we have. Oh, it will be, okay. So you and we'll talk.
He's been holding hands with us throughout the process.
Great. Those are all my comments. Thank you. And I would support moving this forward to the full board.
Oh, okay, we will then receive the report unanimously. And thank you very much. And again, good luck to you going forward.
Thank you.
Item 10 is a report on gun violence, and I think this is being brought forward by the District Attorney's Office, and Mr. Rosen is here with Mr. Shapiro.
Thank you. And I'll just confess, this was something I wanted to bring to our committee because I was very interested in this body of work, and it has some potential financial implications, which is why I was hoping we could look at it.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. I'm Jeff Rosen, the District Attorney, and I have with me Assistant District Attorney James Gibbon Shapiro, who oversees, among other teams in our office, our Crime Strategies Unit, and he and the unit have a presentation for you this afternoon, a brief presentation about our efforts to combat gun violence.
Good afternoon. And first of all, I want to thank both Supervisor Cortese and Supervisor Chavez for their leadership in this area. Supervisor Cortese with the Gun Summit last year and your efforts with gun safety in the home, it's been really amazing. And Supervisor Chavez, your questions to us and other county departments about prohibited persons, I think, has really been important in expanding the scope of our understanding of where the holes are. So I want to talk today about a problem that we have in the county and some solutions to the problem. So, all right, okay, here we go. It took a second to respond. So first of all, the big problem of gun violence is something that I think is known to you. We have well over 100,000 Americans shot every year, 100 Americans killed every year by gun violence, and that problem is not just a problem other places in the United States, it's also a problem here. Dave, am I doing something wrong with this clicker? Can I control this in some way? Oh, with the arrow keys. Okay, I was pressing the wrong button. All right. In addition to costing lives, it also costs an enormous amount of money. So the $18.3 billion estimate for California, that includes hospital costs, social services costs, all sorts of costs in the county and law enforcement costs. It's an amazing drag on all our other efforts. There is a expert at UC Davis. His name is Dr. Wintemute. He is an emergency room physician, and he's also the head of California's research arm on gun violence. And he's been focused, especially in the last year, on prohibited persons. So prohibited persons are people who are ordered by the court to not have guns. And there are about 18,000 people in California who've been ordered by the court not to have guns, and we know they have guns. And that is an undercount because we don't know about the people who've been prohibited by the court from having guns and have unregistered or illegal guns. So that is part of our problem too, is what do we do about people who've been ordered not to have guns and have them anyway? So in our Santa Clara County, the people who are ordered not to have guns fall into three main categories. So about 6,000 people a year are convicted of felonies, and every felon is ordered not to have guns. Actually, as a convicted felon, you're not allowed to have a gun in California or in the United States. About 3,000 felons and misdemeanants, most of those people misdemeanants, are ordered not to have guns because of domestic violence charges in Santa Clara County. And then about 1,600 people in family court because in a civil context, you haven't talked to a police officer, but you've asked for a domestic violence restraining order in family court, and the court orders the person who is restrained to also not have guns. So we have lots of arms in the county to prohibit people from having guns. And what we, like lots of other places in the state, I think actually every other place in the state, falls short is then getting the guns away from the people who the court has ordered you're not allowed to have guns. So since this year, in 2019, the DA's office has begun reviewing every one of our domestic violence criminal cases at the time the order is made prohibiting the person to assess at that person, okay, you're ordered not to have guns, do you have guns? And we've done relinquishment hearings in court and also search warrants, because we know that some people are not honest in court about the fact that they've relinquished their guns, or not honest about the fact that they've lost it or they don't remember where it is. And so we've also helped with our law enforcement partners to do search warrants to actually take those guns away. And that is the missing piece around the state and in our county for these other two areas of the 6,000 felons who are convicted of a felony. You're not allowed to have a gun. What are we doing to actually find out, well, does this person have a gun? and what are we doing to get the gun away from the person? And Dr. Wintemute, who I mentioned before, he was at a conference in San Francisco that Marissa McKeown from the DA's office was also at. They were on a panel discussing exactly this. And he said that's the main problem around the state and around the country is that judges are doing a great job ordering the appropriate people. You're not allowed to have guns, but what's the follow through everywhere to make sure those people don't have guns? And what he says is that the most critical time to get that gun away from the person is the 2-week period after they've been ordered, because after that time, maybe you lose track of where the person is, and it might be stale, the information you have about where their guns are. So that time period is where we can be the most effective in prohibited persons enforcement. So I want to talk a little bit about gun violence in Santa Clara County, and I know you've had a long afternoon of audit review and other things. So I'm going to skip a few slides and go to this one. So in San Jose, our largest city, aggravated assaults with a firearm rose from 2019 to 2018 by more than doubling. So when we talk about gun violence, we often focus on murders, and those murders are an important thing to think about, but most gun violence does not involve someone dying. It involves someone being shot, someone being injured, or it involves someone being robbed with a gun, and maybe no shots are fired, but that's part of gun violence. And in San Jose, the robberies with a firearm also more than doubled from 2019 to 2018. And you might be thinking to yourself first, well, that's probably the problem everywhere in the state. And it's the actual answer is that's not the case. In every big city in California, both aggravated assaults with a firearm and robberies with a firearm in that same 10-year period have gone down. And statewide, they've gone down dramatically just in the last 2 years, but not in Santa Clara County. In Santa Clara County, gun violence is going up and has been going up for a while. And it was easy for us to think in the early years of this, maybe this is a statistical anomaly, but I don't think you can say that after a 10-year trend of that. And I don't want to say that this is a crisis. It's a problem, but it's not a crisis. And the reason I say it's not a crisis is because it's still true that Santa Clara County is one of the safest metropolitan areas in the country and in the state, and that includes gun violence. But let's consider for a moment San Diego, which in 2009, San Jose had fewer aggravated assaults, fewer robberies, and fewer murders than San Diego per capita and in actual numbers. Both per capita and in actual numbers. Well, now San Diego, which has a larger population than San Jose, has fewer robberies with a firearm, fewer aggregated assaults, and fewer murders per capita than we have here in San Jose. And so we've moved from being one of the best in the state to having other metropolitan areas moving in front of us. And you know about 3 very horrible tragedies that we've had, because we've actually had 3 mass shootings in Santa Clara County this summer. One was a man killed 5 members of his family. Another was a man killed co-workers after being let go at a Ford dealership. And the other was, as you know, the Garlic Festival shooting, where 3 people were killed, 4 including the shooter, 12 injured. The killed and injured were also a large percentage of children, and there were actually 1,000 people under the age of 18 who were present at the Garlic Festival at the time of the shooting. So we have challenges in the county that are challenges that are unique to us. And part of the reason why we have challenges here are for a problem that actually in this room we can't solve. And I'll say that because one of the problems we have in the county is that during that 10-year period, the San Jose Police Department, as you know, has fewer officers than it did 10 years ago, and fewer officers per capita than really any other metropolitan area in the United States and any other metropolitan area in California. The national average has officers per capita at double the amount that the San Jose Police Department has. But we can't solve that problem in this room. But it has a little bit to do with why other areas have been effective in reducing gun violence. So for example, Oakland, which has dramatically reduced gun violence. By about 50%, they've reduced gun violence over the last 10 years. And they've increased officers. One of the things they've done, which has gotten a lot of publicity, is they've done a lot of work with nonprofits. And we have a similar arm in Santa Clara County, the East Side Peace Project, and we can do more with them. But less heralded is the fact that they have been doing really some basic police work. Is where is the gun violence happening? We need to dedicate more officers to that area, and they've increased officers in order to do that, and that's been effective in reducing gun violence. But we don't have the luxury of doing that in, well, I don't want to say the luxury. We can't do that in Santa Clara County because the San Jose Police Department is understaffed, and we can't control that here in this room. But there are things that we can do to be smart about the resources that we have. So one is gun violence restraining orders. So you've heard about red flag laws. So 3 years ago, Santa Clara County had only done 3 gun violence restraining orders in the whole county. That does not mean that there weren't people threatening to shoot a school or threatening to kill themselves. It was an understood tool for law enforcement, where law enforcement, when notified of a threat, can get a court order to remove guns from a person who is dangerous. Last year, 2018, the DA's office went on a countywide campaign to teach law enforcement about this tool, and the number went from 3 to over 30. And as those officers have learned more about it, in 2019, we're going to have done more than 100 gun violence restraining orders in Santa Clara County. So that's a huge way that we can prevent gun violence, is that when we know about someone who's doing a threat, what can we do to take the guns away from that person, either temporarily for a 2 or 3 week period, or if the judge orders for much longer than that. But we, in addition to that, and we need to do more in that area, what can we do to be smarter with the resources we have? So one has to do with that prohibited persons enforcement. So I'll tell you, start with what's not working. In family court, if someone gets a domestic violence restraining order and the judge says, okay, I'm ordering that the person who's been harassing you, threatening you, and violent to you, I'm ordering that that person has no more guns. And you've told me that you know that they have guns. And what the judge does with that order is gives it to the victim or her attorney and says, there's your order. That's what happens. And it puts the onus on the victim to try to figure out how to enforce that order. What should be happening instead is all those 1,600 orders should be coming to the DA's office. We should be able to pull all the police reports, run the background check, do the criminal history, run the records through the Department of Justice, and triage for law enforcement who actually has these guns, and then present that packet of information to San Jose Police Department, Palo Alto Police Department, Gilroy Police Department, with the then knowledge, you go enforce this order, and we will prosecute that case, because that's a crime, actually, to possess a gun in violation of the court order. You need a search warrant, we will help you write that search warrant. That's what should be happening.
And whose jurisdiction is that? State? Does that require a change in state law?
It requires no change in state law. It requires the will to do it.
No, but
And
whose will? Is it the presiding judge of the family court, or?
The family court order is a public document. It is not a private document like juvenile court records. There's no reason why either the court could give it to us, or if they felt like they couldn't, where we could have a paralegal or some other staff member go to the court and collect those orders. They are public documents.
Well, what's stopping you? I guess that's on.
James,
Yeah.
Dave, maybe I can help with this.
I'm not trying to be argumentative.
No. That is the heart of what we're talking about,
Yeah,
Supervisor.
and let me just say what why I bugged them about this is that the protocol for it had been that the judges write the order, they send it to the state sends it back to the jurisdiction, and the jurisdiction was responsible for making, in some instances, for making sure that gun got collected. In other instances, the point that James raised is that literally we're asking the victim to go to the police department and
In the civil side, I've done many of those myself when I was practicing law full time. Right?
But this,
and people can do them pro
Right.
per or pro se.
But the only difference is here is that rather than waiting for the orders to come back, they can intervene now and get those to the police departments faster. The other thing is they weren't being triaged. The mechanism for doing that would be each police department. I think the point you raised about we would not be having this conversation if, honestly, I would have gone to the San Jose PD if they had personnel and said, hey guys and gals, you should be doing this. And we've had this conversation with the sheriff's office as well, because really it's a protocol change that we have the capacity to do, that somebody should be doing it.
Yeah, and I get that, and I want to do it, and I'm just trying to get to the point of what the hell's needed. You need money for people to run.
I mean,
I don't know. Somebody. It sounds like you need somebody to run back and forth.
I'll cut to the absolute end. So what we're asking for is we're asking for a prosecutor dedicated to the enforcement of the prohibited persons orders and related issues for trying to be smart and triage these packets for law enforcement and then prosecute those cases when they're coming in, to help write the search warrants and then prosecute the people who are in violation of the court's orders. So that's one of the asks.
And you need some kind of a runner, literally, for public records requests on a continuous loop basis.
Yeah, I think actually we'll be able to do that electronically. We have access to the family court system. Those court orders are public documents. We should be able to pull those electronically.
Okay.
So I think that we'll be able to do a data solution. And I'll just say that I'm so impressed with our DA's office information services team. Whenever we ask them to do something like that, I don't know how they figure it out, but they always seem to figure it out. So I'm confident that we'll be able to figure that part out.
Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt your cadence, but I wanted to try to, as you said, get to the heart of that.
I would actually go to the
last
last slide. Yeah. And let me just make one other point, Dave, because you're asking the right question, is that I want to say that one of the things that I had a hard time believing is that we had victims of domestic violence who were explaining this process that they had been subjected to, is probably the best word. And the thing I just want to show appreciation for is that a lot of this work James started doing by hand and working primarily with the San Jose Police Department, I think, to get started. And I was wondering, could you just take 2 sentences to explain what you did and what the results were and why you're bringing this forward?
Sure. The first thing we did was, and when we did it, you're absolutely right, Supervisor Chavez, I personally did it. So I asked my staff to give me the list of every person who was arraigned in criminal domestic violence court, and then to also run the list of did any of those persons own any registered firearms. And it wasn't hard. I had those 2 lists in front of me. And then every day I would send email to the assigned attorney, we need to either do a relinquishment hearing on this case or we need to do a search warrant on this case. So please advise me what you think is most appropriate, and we're going to do that. And that work started this year, and I'm going to be handing it off in January to someone else. But I've been doing it. I have one on my desk right now from today. So I've been doing that every day, and that was really a good start to this. But I think the thing that
Can I ask a question about?
Yeah, sure.
It's just, it goes right to the heart of that matter, and I've been wanting to ask somebody like you who's been in the middle of it ever since I talked to federal enforcement officers and state enforcement officers about it, and they weren't sure. How do you get around HIPAA when you're dealing with the prohibited persons list that involves mental health? I understand the rest of them. I understand clearly, as someone who's practiced law in the criminal system and family court system, about the differential you made on the restraining orders and how that information would need to be retrieved, as public records. I understand all of that. It's just a very technical question.
Yeah.
Can, the way I've been HIPAA trained here, if I had a list on my computer of people with mental illnesses here in Santa Clara County, and I had another list of people who had felonies, my training is that I can't mix and match those without violating HIPAA. And so I
Those
don't know
two
how you
things,
get
you're
around that.
absolutely right, cannot be mixed and matched because there's both protections for the criminal offender record information and there's protections for the medical information. But if the mentally ill person has been committed to a mental institution, and that would include our emergency mental health institution at Valley Medical Center
Yeah.
for more than 24 hours, so a day's commitment. If they've actually been committed for 24 hours, then a court order that is not a medical record goes out to the Department of Justice that that person is now a prohibited person from having gun records. And part of the problem that we were having, that we have and everywhere in the country has, is who's looking at those records. So the next part of what I was going to say is that we started pulling a list from the Department of Justice of the people in our county who have been had mental health orders or have had multiple restraining orders or multiple felony convictions and also own guns. And we provided a list, and we would do a triage packet to try to figure out all the things we could. And we provided a list, 10 a month, to the San Jose Police Department. We started that in May and said, here's 10 people, let's go do some enforcement to make sure that this person who is prohibited from having guns and is there's a Department of Justice record that they have a gun, let's make sure that we can do that. And that's a limited thing we can do. I think something we've done that's more effective with San Jose PD is something we started about 6 weeks ago, and we're calling it our Priority Gun Offender Program. So this is where, again, the DA's office is doing the triage. There are people who already have a warrant for their arrest. And instead of sitting in the queue of, we'll get to that warrant when we finish these 10 that are on top of it, we're trying to triage that queue for which of these people do we know is involved in gun violence. And then we triage, we have intel analysts going through the data from the shootings that have been happening in the county, from the gang intelligence that we have in the county, to triage that list. And we've been giving a couple a week to the San Jose Police Department, and it's been enormously successful. And what I mean by that is they do a search warrant on that person's home, they arrest them on the warrant they already have for them, and they also find multiple other guns, drugs, and evidence of other crimes. And so that's a way that we can that's a way we can be smarter about the way we do gun enforcement, but it requires some thinking. And that's why the intel analysts are important. That's why the investigator is important. So, what the team we have right now is we have a gun prosecutor who mostly works on regional gun crime issues, and we do have a problem in Santa Clara County of actually a shooting war happening between rival gangs who are involved in illegal gambling in cafes and warehouses and pop-up volleyball clubs, and it's a very lucrative business, and they're shooting each other over it. And that is a regional issue because even though those gangs are often based in San Jose, the gang ties go across the region, and we had we had a shootout in Modesto involving San Jose people just a few weeks ago, and it was related to that thing. So one of our gun prosecutors, that's the kind of thing he works on, is multi-agency, regional gun problems. He also works on gun trafficking into Santa Clara County or manufactured guns in Santa Clara County. We need an additional gun prosecutor to work on this, prohibited persons, and to help triage these priority gun offenders. And the same thing with our situation with our intel analysts is when the Crime Strategies Unit, which is the unit that I supervise that Jeff Rosen founded in our county in 2016, we're one of a handful of counties that has a Crime Strategies Unit dedicated to gun violence and burglaries. When it was founded, the Police Chiefs Association said, we're going to take some of the UASI money, I don't know if you're familiar with UASI money, that is usually spent on tactical gear and tactical operational equipment, and we'll give it to the DA's office to hire some analysts, or rather to contract with some analysts, they're not county employees, to contract with some analysts to get this off the ground. And what we're asking is, the police chiefs have appropriately said, okay, you got it off the ground. We want to use that money for what it's actually meant for. And so we're asking that those analysts be funded by the county because of the work they're doing for the county. And the same thing for the additional investigator is to provide that intelligence and the backgrounding that triage is for our police agencies, especially San Jose PD, work that they can't do. You know, the merge unit at San Jose PD is excellent. They will surround a house and do a high danger search warrant in a very safe and effective way. But what they need is, whose house do we surround? Who do we arrest? And that's the thing that we've been providing, and we can do so much more at with intel analyst, investigator, and additional gun prosecutor.
Okay, so we made it to the last slide. I still have questions about the HIPAA thing, not because I don't want the end result of that to happen, but I'm not going to. I can talk to you guys offline about the question and answer on that, but it just continues to strike me that just because an individual is told you're prohibited from having a gun by an order, and I've seen the orders, because of a state law, that suddenly allows a waiver of that person's HIPAA rights for that information to be transferred to an enforcement officer who's going to go out and say, you're mentally ill. Oh, how did you know that? I haven't waived my HIPAA rights. So I think there's an issue there just in terms of liability that may require us to mandate that disclosures be, or HIPAA waivers be incorporated into those forms somehow, but that's a side issue.
No, I think that's an important issue, and I'll say that one of the things that we've been much more effective on in mentally ill gun offenders than the list of prohibited gun offenders is gun violence restraining orders. That when somebody calls and says, my neighbor is decompensating, and I think they're off their meds, and they're threatening to shoot a school, and this is actually, when I say there have been 100 gun violence restraining orders in Santa Clara County this year, that's what I'm talking about. Right. And that's when a court will order that person's guns to be relinquished, and that's something that can happen without that problem that you're talking about. We need to do more of it.
Yeah, again, I don't want to belabor the point. It's one thing to order somebody to relinquish their guns. It's something else to then out them on their mental health issue to the general public. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, you can tell me to cease and desist, do whatever, put my hands up, whatever you want. There's a lot of orders you can give me, but if you turn around and get a bullhorn and start telling people I have a clinically diagnosed mental health problem and that's why you did it, there's a HIPAA issue there, in my humble opinion. But I just want to make sure, I know it's state law and everybody's doing it, I just want to make sure, you know, that we protect the county as a whole in terms of the Treasury, make sure we don't get sued someday.
If you or your staff would like an offline report for some legal analysis on that, I'm happy to do that.
Talk to you guys in county council. I don't want to, as I said, belabor here. So.
Yeah, so what I'd like to do is make two recommendations. One is that we move, and Dave, I should ask you what you think about this, because there are two ways we could do it. The reason I had it come here is I thought it was a financial issue. I think the point you raise about HIPAA is very significant. I also think that the work that you've been doing around gun safety means that where we have an opportunity to be more proactive, that I'd really like the county to be doing that. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing, just to be blunt, is I think that we're going to take on some cost and responsibility that should be more shared with the cities than it may be, you know, but I think in order to get it started, we don't really have a lot of options but to take a leadership role both in operationalizing it and funding it.
My expectation was, you know, that you would want to move a recommendation either today or by separate referral to the Board of Supervisors to you know, for the administration to come back with the funding options for, you know, closing this gap, you know, is particularly in terms of the restraining order issue, if nothing else, because I know all the work. I've been in the hearings with you. We've heard about that. We know what needs to be done. I don't want the HIPAA question I'm raising to hold that up. I think that's an issue that may require disclosures or a workaround or something at some point in time. But I think that can be looked at separately. I'm just raising a concern about potential liability, but not to stop this from going forward. So if that's what you want to do, I'd be happy to second it. You were, you know, as you said, brought this ask for this to be put on today's agenda. And then I would just, so I'm supportive, I would, and it's a referral, it's an operational referral. We don't have to wait till budget time.
Right.
This is not an inventory item type
Right.
of item. And I'd also just like to say thank you to the district attorney and Mr. Gibbons Shapiro. Spent a lot of time in my office during the year getting us launched on the safe storage project. We then turned around and tried to adapt some urban and municipal models to something that we felt would be more appropriate in a county that's both large urban but also large rural. And I think we were able to accomplish that. The jury's still out. We've got comments, we're getting comments from people, but they seem to be pretty benign at this point. So thank you for, you thanked us, but thank you for bringing that stuff over to our policy side and letting us kick it around until we can figure out how to do it. But Supervisor Chavez, on this one, you've been taking the initiative, particularly through the domestic violence and gender violence side. And if you want to move this, I'm happy to support it. I know we don't often get to do referrals directly from the committee to the administration, to bring back a cost package. I don't mind doing that, or just sending it to the Board of Supervisors, under your motion, with the request that the costing out of this come with it.
That's exactly what I would
So we
would
can
move.
act all in one day, so we don't have to spend 2 or 3 board meetings
Great.
kicking this around, because somebody gets hurt in the meanwhile.
Right. I'll make that motion. Thank you. for
Okay,
that,
and it's
Dave.
seconded, and
And do you want to refer the mental health issue now too?
yeah, and I just look at, like, we can get that on attorney-client privileged format, and maybe county council can just at least communicate with the DA's office. I know it's primarily county council that'll look at any kind of liability issues that I was framing, but obviously we want to share it with the folks that are actually pushing not only the paperwork but the enforcement side of it. So that can just be in a parallel universe, just as far as I'm concerned. But we'll call that a request for information. How's that?
That's great.
And but I just want to be clear that we're asking the administration to come back with a cost package on this at the earliest available board meeting. Obviously not next Tuesday. That's a little soon, but perhaps the first meeting in January. Does that meet your
That would be great.
requirements? All right. Okay.
Supervisor
that's-
Cortese, just a quick clarification. Are you looking for a memo to you or for the deputy county counsel who normally works with the DA to answer that question for the DA?
to the Board of Supervisors, share it with the Board of Supervisors, essentially as a routine legal opinion that was requested by our Board of Supervisors, usual format. But in this case, I'm also asking that it be shared with the DA's office, which is adding a couple folks on, right? To what our normal distribution would be, so they can take a look at it too. Okay. And respond to it. They may see it differently.
Great.
Thank you.
Dave. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Last but not least, Fairgrounds Management Corporation has been on deck for a while, on deck, in the hole, in the dugout. Probably went off and got a hot dog and came back. Okay. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for being here. We know that the possible actions today are to receive a report about the amended and restated management agreement, and items B, C, and D on the agenda, which would include forwarding the amended and restated management agreement that's before us today to the Board of Supervisors, but it also includes some discussion about budget and business plans. So feel welcome to cut to the chase. I will say one thing right at the top that might speed things up under the circumstances is that my amended and restated management agreement isn't redlined or whatever the, well, I don't know if it is. I don't know where the changes are. Let me put it that way.
Bruce Knopf, Director of Asset and Economic Development. This is a restated agreement, and so it is really based on the county's current template. The agreement that is in place now was approved in the year 2000, and so there are it would not be useful to have provided a redlined copy because it would just be redline.
So it's a completely different
It's a completely
form,
different,
if you will.
That's correct. It is completely different form. I would say that many of the original obligations under the current agreement have been transferred over and exist in this agreement. For example, the annual presentation of a budget and business plan, and presentation of an audit, and an estimated year-end financial. Those requirements are substantially the same, but there are a number of new business terms that respond to the board referral of October 8th, and those are summarized in the staff report and included obviously in the proposed amended and restated agreement.
Right. I'll turn it over to Supervisor Chavez for any comments, concerns, or if you need more in the agreement or less. Otherwise, we should be moving it on to the Board of Supervisors.
I recommend that we move it to the board. I mean, the period. Yeah.
Okay. I do not object to that. I would say to the extent you can prepare either a chart or one or two slides for the Board of Supervisors in case the questions come up, as even though the form is completely different and changed, maybe all the more reason to just present what you just did orally in terms of where the substantive incorporations of changes pursuant to the board direction have either where they appear or just your assurances that they're there, and what,
I'd be happy to
what
do
they
that.
say. That would be helpful. I know my staff had a little bit of trouble trying to figure out if direction that I was personally giving as one of the board members showed up. I think it did based on my reading, but it would be helpful, especially to those board members who aren't here today.
We can do that.
Thank you. So there was a motion by Supervisor Chavez to move the recommendations A through E, which includes receiving the reports, plural, and forwarding the recommendations. So that's unanimous. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate your work. That brings us to adjournment right on time. Good thing we didn't do both those audits. We are scheduled to resume this journey through FGOC on Thursday, January 9th, 2020 at 2 p.m. unless it's noticed for a different time. But that's what's scheduled currently. Thank you, everyone. Sorry for the long meeting. I think we got some work done, though.